The Mafia boss found his secretary locked in a basement. He was too late. He didn't knock. He never knocked. Kwon Tae-hyuk walked into Zuri Whitfield's office at 5:47 in the evening, closed the door behind him, and stood in front of her desk, like a man who had already made every decision that mattered. He looked at her the way predators look at something they've already caught, not with hunger but with the flat, patient certainty of someone who simply needs to finish the job. "You found something," he said. It wasn't a question. Zuri looked up from her screen. She kept her face still. She had learned a long time ago that stillness was its own kind of armor. "I'm finishing the quarterly reconciliation," she said. "Is there something you need, Mr. Kwon?" He smiled. That was the part that would stay with her, the smile. Unhurried and almost gentle, the kind of expression a person wears when they no longer need to pretend. "No," he said, "I just wanted to see you." He left. 26 minutes later, Zuri Whitfield walked out of Haneul Meridian Holdings for the last time. Security cameras captured her at 6:21 p.m., briefcase in hand, steps even and measured. She did not know that a white utility van had been parked 2 levels below in the underground garage for the past 4 hours. She did not know the man behind the wheel had been paid $40,000 to make sure she never made it home. By 6:36 p.m., the cameras on the garage level went dark. 15 minutes of footage gone, and Zuri Whitfield disappeared into the night like she had never existed at all. If you were her, if you spent years quietly protecting someone who never once thought to protect you, how long would it take before you stopped waiting for them to notice you were gone? If this story already has your heart pounding, you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story like this one. We post new dramatic fiction every week, and trust us, you don't want to be late. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. We want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it really began. The morning Zuri Whitfield disappeared, Seok-won had 3 back-to-back meetings and a conference call with a Port Authority contact in Seattle. He didn't notice she was gone until 11 a.m. when he reached for his coffee and found it wasn't there. That was the thing about Zuri. She had been so precise for so long. Coffee at exactly 8:15, documents ready before he asked, calls screened and sorted and prioritized with a competence so seamless it had become invisible that her absence registered first as a small inconvenience rather than an alarm. He pressed the intercom button, got nothing, assumed she was in the copy room or downstairs with procurement. By 2 p.m. he sent a text, no reply. By 4 p.m. he told himself she must be sick. People got sick. Zuri rarely called in, but she was human. He made a note to have someone send flowers if she was out tomorrow as well. He went home at 8 p.m. and slept soundly. That was day 1. Seok-won was 41 years old and had controlled the Eastern Seaboard's most quietly powerful Korean-American criminal network since his late 20s. He had built Haneul Meridian Holdings from a single import office in Fort Lee into a corporation with 400 employees, 16 international shipping contracts, and a web of arrangements with port officials, customs brokers, and logistics executives that moved far more than declared cargo across Pacific shipping lanes. He was not a man who frightened easily. He was not a man who made many mistakes. But he had made one very consistent mistake for 7 years, and her name was Zuri Whitfield, and the mistake was so ordinary it was almost embarrassing. He had assumed that because she was always there, she would always be there. He had confused reliability with permanence. He had taken the most competent person in his organization and treated her the way people treat good infrastructure, grateful for it, in a vague, distant way, and completely unprepared for the moment it stops working. Zuri had started at Haneul Meridian as a junior executive assistant 8 years ago, 25 years old with a business administration degree from Rutgers, and the kind of quiet intensity that either breaks under pressure or calcifies into something harder and more useful. Calcified. Within 18 months, she was managing Seok-won's entire executive calendar, handling correspondence in 3 languages through a translator she trained herself, and maintaining a level of discretion about his affairs that most of his lieutenants couldn't manage after a decade. She knew things. Not everything Seok-won was careful, but enough. enough to understand what the restricted shipping manifests meant, enough to recognize certain names that appeared in payment authorizations, enough to know that Haneul Meridian operated in spaces that legitimate businesses did not. She had never asked him directly about any of it. He had never offered. That arrangement had suited them both, or so he'd believed. What he hadn't understood, what he would spend months after trying to absorb, was that Zuri had known far more than he'd realized and had spent years using that knowledge not to protect herself, but to protect him. By the second morning, Seok-won was irritated rather than worried. He had Jin-tae try her personal number, no answer. He had someone drive by her apartment in Hoboken. Her car was in the lot, lights off. That made him pause slightly, but people left cars behind. She could have taken the PATH train. She could be staying with family. He had a shipment arriving from Incheon that afternoon that required his signature on 3 separate documents. He found the previous year's forms in the system himself, misfiled them twice, and wasted 40 minutes on something Zuri handled in under 5. That evening, Jin-tae came to his office and stood in front of the desk with the aggression he reserved for things that required careful delivery. Her apartment manager let our man inside, Jin-tae said. Her keys are on the kitchen counter. Her phone charger is still plugged in. She packed nothing. Seok-won stared at him. Her desk, Jin-tae continued. We found her employee badge in the top drawer, her personal calendar. And this, he set a folded piece of paper on the desk. Seok-won unfolded it. The handwriting was Zuri's neat, slightly compressed, the capital letters a little taller than the rest. If something feels wrong, start inside your own house. He read it twice. He looked up at Jin-tae. Pull every security log from the past 2 weeks, Seok-won said. Every floor, every access point, every vendor entry. Tonight, Jin-tae nodded once and left. Seok-won sat alone in his office for a long time after that. The building had mostly emptied. The city pressed its noise against the glass. He held the piece of paper and looked at her handwriting and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have a name for yet. Not quite guilt, not quite fear, something older and more corrosive than either. He had told her to leave it to security. She had written a note and hidden it under her desk instead, which meant she knew that security was exactly the problem. The footage gap showed up in the first hour of the review. 15 minutes of garage-level recording, wiped cleanly enough that the system log didn't even register an error. It simply showed a gap, the way a sentence reads when a word has been lifted out. Someone with system-level access had done it. Someone who knew the architecture of Haneul Meridian security network well enough to remove footage without triggering an alert. That narrowed the field considerably. Seok-won brought in 3 men he trusted completely: Jin-tae, a former military intelligence officer named Cho Min-soo, who handled internal security reviews, and a logistics analyst named Park Hyun-gi, who had been with the organization for 11 years and whose loyalty had been tested multiple times. He did not tell the broader security team. He did not tell HR. He did not tell his executive leadership group. He told nobody that Zuri Whitfield had been abducted from his building. Because whoever had taken her was almost certainly still coming to work every morning. The maintenance contractor record surfaced on the 3rd day of investigation. A work order submitted through the facilities management system, timestamped 2:17 p. On the day Zuri disappeared, routine HVAC inspection on sublevel 2. Contractor name Meridian Climate Solutions, LLC. Identification verified at the security desk. Badge issued. Vehicle logged into the underground garage, a white utility van, commercial plates. Min-soo ran the company registration. Meridian Climate Solutions had been dissolved 14 months earlier. Failure to file annual reports. Its registered agent had been a law office that specialized in shell company administration. The office itself had closed 8 months ago. Seok-won's jaw tightened when he heard this. The security officer who logged the badge, he said. Where is he now? Min-soo was quiet for a moment. Resigned last week. Said he was relocating to his wife's family in Georgia. His wife's family, he's not married. We checked his HR file. Seok-won pushed back from the desk and walked to the window. 40 stories below, The Hudson caught the late afternoon light and turned it copper. He had built this organization. He had hired these people. He had approved the security protocols and the vendor vetting procedures and the access control systems. And somewhere inside all of it, someone had built a door that only they could see. I want traffic camera footage from every exit within 4 blocks of this building, he said. Starting at 5:30 that evening. It took Min Su's team until the following afternoon to find it a white utility van, commercial plates, captured on a city traffic camera at the intersection of Marin Boulevard and Christopher Columbus Drive at 6:43 p. The timestamp matched. The direction of travel matched. They followed it through 6 additional cameras, losing it twice, picking it up again near the Pulaski Skyway. Then nothing. The van exited the frame on a county road outside Kearney and didn't reappear in any camera system they had access to. But by then, Yoon-gi had been doing something else. He had spent 2 nights going through property records, abandoned commercial properties, foreclosed industrial buildings, locations within a 15-mile radius that had been purchased through holding companies in the past 3 years. He was looking for somewhere a person could be kept without anyone noticing. Somewhere with loading access, minimal foot traffic, no residential neighbors close enough to matter. He found 17 possibilities. They started eliminating them by overnight satellite imagery, proximity to traffic patterns, visible security presence. By the morning of day 4, they had 3 locations. Seok-won drove to all 3 himself. He didn't tell his driver where they were going. He sat in the back of a black SUV with Jin-tae beside him and Min-su in the passenger seat and felt the particular cold that comes not from temperature, but from sitting with something you cannot undo. He had been doing the calculation over and over in his mind, and it never resolved differently. She had been missing for 4 days. She had been taken from his building. The people who took her had done so with inside access, which meant they were not amateurs, which meant whatever they had planned for her was deliberate, not impulsive. He did not allow himself to finish that thought. The first 2 locations were empty, genuinely empty, no signs of recent use. The second one smelled of mold and showed no evidence of vehicle access in months. The third was a warehouse on the western edge of Jersey City, a concrete block building that had once processed industrial cleaning supplies, closed 6 years ago. Chain-link fencing around a cracked lot with a rusted loading dock door on the south face. Min-su pointed at the ground near the loading dock entrance. Fresh tire tracks in the mud. Recent rain had filled the edges slightly, but the center was still sharp. A vehicle with a wide wheelbase, consistent with a commercial van, had backed up to that door recently. Within the past 72 hours, Seok-won was out of the SUV before it fully stopped. He had a medical team waiting 3 blocks away, told only that there might be a person requiring emergency care. He had 2 of Min-su's men with him. He had told nobody else where he was. The loading dock door was padlocked. Min-su cut it in under 40 seconds. The interior was dark. The smell hit first cold, concrete, stagnant air, something organic beneath it that made Seok-won's stomach clench. Min-su had a flashlight. The beam moved across an empty floor, rusted shelving units, the skeleton of an old conveyor system. Then Seok-won saw the interior door to the left. It had a new padlock on it. Not rusted, not old. He didn't wait for Min-su. He picked up a length of metal pipe from the floor and hit the padlock twice, 3 times. The sound enormous in the hollow building. And on the 4th swing, the bracket tore free from the rotting door frame, and the door swung open. The room was small, concrete walls, a single industrial light fixture in the ceiling, dead. The beam of Min-su's flashlight swept across the floor. And there she was. Zuri Whitfield was sitting against the far wall with her back straight and her wrists bound in front of her with heavy zip ties. Her charcoal blazer was torn at the shoulder. Her dark curls hung across her face. There was a bruise along her left jaw and dried blood at the corner of her mouth. Her eyes were closed. Seok-won crossed the room in 4 steps and went to his knees in front of her. Zuri. Nothing, Zuri. He said her name louder this time, one hand reaching for her face, fingers against her cheek. Her skin was cold, too cold. He felt a terror move through him that was unlike anything a rival, or a weapon, or a federal threat had ever produced. Something primitive and complete, the specific horror of being responsible for the life of another person and arriving too late. "She's breathing," Minsu said, from behind him, 2 fingers against her throat. "Pulse is weak, but it's there." Seok-won cut the zip ties with a blade from his jacket pocket. Her hands fell forward. The skin beneath was raw and purple. "Get the medical team," he said. His voice came out flat and controlled. He had trained himself over 20 years to sound like that, steady, commanding, emptied of anything that could be read as weakness. The hands, when he wrapped them around Zuri's cold fingers, were not steady. He sat on the concrete floor of a derelict warehouse in Jersey City and held the hands of a woman who had spent 7 years keeping his world from unraveling, and he listened to her breathe, shallow, irregular, but there, present, alive, and he tried to understand how he had let this happen. Not in the abstract, specifically, concretely. 3 days ago, she had stood in his office doorway and told him something felt wrong on the executive floor. He had barely looked up from his desk. He told her it was probably nothing. He had said security would handle it and returned to whatever document had been in front of him. And Zuri had said, "Yes, sir," and closed the door. And that had been the last time he would see her standing up for months. The medical team arrived. They worked fast and said very little, the way skilled people do when they're focused. An IV line, vitals, a neck brace as a precaution. One of the paramedics, a compact woman with gray at her temples, looked up at Seok-won after 2 minutes of assessment. "She's severely dehydrated," the paramedic said, "possibly hypothermic. There may be other injuries we can't assess here. She needs a hospital." "Another 24 hours?" Seok-won asked. The woman looked at him without flinching. Another 24 hours to have changed this conversation significantly. He heard her. He heard every word of it. He stood back and watched them load Zuri onto a stretcher and carry her toward the door, and the industrial smell of that room and the image of her sitting there with her back straight against a concrete wall, even unconscious, back straight, as if some part of her had refused to collapse, stayed with him in a way he already knew he would never entirely put down. Jin-tae appeared beside him. The older man said nothing for a moment. "She left a note," Seok-won said. His voice was quiet, almost conversational. "She knew. She had already figured it out, and she told me, and I told her to leave it to security." Jin-tae was quiet. "Pull everything from her office," Seok-won said. "Every file, every notebook, every piece of paper. I want to know exactly what she found." And then Seok-won looked at the empty room, the zip ties on the floor, the cold concrete wall where she had been sitting for 4 days. And then he said, "We figure out which one of my men did this." He walked out of the warehouse into cold gray daylight, and something in the way he moved had changed, not visibly, not in any way the casual eye would catch. But Jin-tae had known him for 20 years, and he saw it immediately. The calculation Seok-won was running was no longer about damage control. It was about understanding how completely and for how long he had been blind, and who, inside his own walls, had been counting on that blindness to survive. Seok-won didn't sleep that night. He sat in the ICU waiting area on the 4th floor of a private medical facility in Weehawken, a place he used when situations required discretion, and drank bad coffee from a paper cup and stared at the wall across from him. The chairs were designed to be functional rather than comfortable, and the overhead lighting had that particular institutional quality that made everything look slightly worse than it was. He sat in it for 6 hours without moving much. Jin-tae sat 2 seats down and said almost nothing, which was one of the reasons Seok-won had kept him close for 2 decades. Around 3 a.m., one of the doctors came out and told him Zuri was stable. Dehydration, mild hypothermia, 2 cracked ribs, likely from the initial abduction rather than the confinement. No head trauma beyond surface bruising. She had not regained consciousness yet, but her vitals were improving, and there was no indication of permanent damage. Seok-won thanked the doctor with the same tone he used to approve shipping manifests. After the doctor left, Jin-tae said quietly, "She's going to be all right." I heard him. "I mean it as something other than a medical update." Seok-won looked at him. I know what you mean. He crushed the paper cup and set it on the seat beside him and stood up. I want her office materials by morning. Everything Min-soo pulled. My conference room, 7 a.m. It'll be there. And I want the vendor records for the past 18 months. Every contractor who accessed this building, every payment authorization above $50,000, every access badge issued to non-employees. He paused. Don't tell anyone why. Jin-tae nodded. Not even Tae-hyuk, Seok-won added. There was a fraction of a beat, nearly nothing. A breath's worth of hesitation before Jin-tae said, understood. Seok-won caught it. He filed it away and said nothing. He arrived at Haneul Meridian at 6:48 a.m. The building was quiet at that hour, just the overnight security staff, and a few early arrivals from the logistics team on the third floor. He used his private elevator to reach the executive level and walked through the empty corridor to his office, past Zuri's desk, which sat exactly as she had left it. Organized and precise and wrong, in the way that orderly things become wrong when the person who maintained them is suddenly absent. He did not look at it for long. The conference room materials were already laid out when he arrived. Min-soo had done a thorough job. Archive boxes from Zuri's office. Her desktop hard drive cloned, her personal planner, a stack of printed documents with colored index tabs, 2 external drives, a manila folder thick enough that the clasp strained. Seok-won sat down and opened the folder first. He read for 2 hours without stopping. What Zuri had been keeping quietly, methodically, over the course of what appeared to be at least 3 years was not a single file or a single document. It was a system, a carefully maintained parallel record of Haneul Meridian's financial and operational irregularities, cross-referenced against legitimate records, annotated in her compressed handwriting with dates, amounts, discrepancies, and in some cases the names of individuals she suspected were involved. She had caught a ghost vendor scheme in 2021 that had been diverting payments through a freight subcontractor that existed only on paper. She had flagged it internally, rerouted the payment authorization to a secondary review process, and quietly notified the company's outside accounting firm, not through official channels, but through a personal contact she had apparently cultivated. The scheme had been shut down before it cost the company more than $200,000. There was no record anywhere in the official audit trail of how it had been caught. She had caught it. She had fixed it. She had not made it a performance. In 2022, she had identified a pattern of suspicious meeting requests from 3 individuals who claimed to be potential business partners but whose contact details were registered to addresses that, according to property records, she had apparently verified herself were either vacant lots or commercial mail forwarding services. She had intercepted those meeting requests, rescheduled them into oblivion, and flagged the names to a federal law enforcement contact. There was a redacted email thread in the file that suggested she had been in occasional communication with someone she identified only as R for at least 2 years. Seok-won set that page down very carefully. He picked it up again. He read it a second time. She had a federal contact. His secretary, his executive's secretary, the woman who sat 12 feet from his office door for 7 years, had been in quiet, careful communication with someone in federal law enforcement, using that relationship not to expose him, but apparently to route information about external threats in a way that protected Haneul Meridian without triggering scrutiny of its other operations. She had been managing his exposure, without his knowledge, without his permission, and she had been doing it to keep him safe. He sat with that for a long time. Min-soo arrived at 8:15, coffee in hand, looking like a man who had also not slept. He set a new folder on the table without preamble. Vendor access records. I flagged anything that didn't clear verification. How many flags? 11 entries that show either a dissolved entity, an unverifiable contact, or a discrepancy between the work order and the badge access log. Over what period? 8 months. Seok-won looked up. 8 months. Someone has been running a testing operation, Min-soo said. Small intrusions, seeing what the system catches. The Meridian Climate Solutions entry wasn't the first fake contractor through this building. It was just the first one that had a secondary objective. Who approved the vendor vetting protocol for contractor access? Min-soo didn't answer immediately. Min-soo. The authorization framework for contractor vetting was restructured 14 months ago, Min-soo said. It was consolidated under the COO's office as part of the operational efficiency review. The room was very quiet. Tae-hyuk restructured contractor vetting, Seok-won said. Yes. 14 months ago. Yes. Seok-won stood up from the table. He walked to the window and stood with his back to Min-soo for a moment. Outside, the city was fully awake now, the streets moving, with the particular mechanical energy of a Tuesday morning, indifferent and continuous. He watched it without seeing it. Kwon Tae-hyuk had been with Haneul Meridian for 11 years. He had come to Seok-won through a referral from a contact in the Korean-American business community in Queens, a man whose judgment Seok-won had trusted and whose trust had been earned over years of careful dealing. Tae-hyuk was competent, organized, and discreet. He had been promoted to COO 3 years ago, after demonstrating a particular talent for operational efficiency, cutting costs, without cutting capability, renegotiating vendor contracts, streamlining the logistics infrastructure in ways that improved margins across the board. He was 52 years old. He had a daughter at Columbia. He played golf on weekends and sent Seok-won a bottle of good whiskey every year at the New Year. Seok-won had never had a reason to doubt him. He turned back from the window. I want his financial records, personal accounts, not just corporate. I want to know every vendor relationship he's authorized in the past 2 years, every payment above $10,000 that crossed his desk, and every external contact logged against his corporate communications account. That kind of pull will tip him off if he's monitoring the system. Then be invisible about it. Seok-won looked at Min-soo directly. Can you do that? I can do that. Then do it. And nobody hears his name from either of us until I say otherwise. Min-soo left. Seok-won returned to Zuri's files. Her personal planner was the last thing he opened, and he almost didn't. A sound like. It felt like a boundary, the difference between reviewing operational records and reading something private, something that belonged to the interior of a person's life rather than their professional function. He held it for a moment, the cover worn at the corners, a small elastic band holding it closed. He opened it. The first thing he noticed was that she had used it for both work and personal reminders, layered together on the same pages without apparent hierarchy. A note about a board meeting preparations sat beside a reminder to call someone named Danielle, a relative. He guessed on a birthday. A reminder about a vendor contract renewal appeared below a note about a colleague's wife who was undergoing chemotherapy, with a medication name written in the margin and an arrow pointing to the notation. Check if insurance covers this help, if not. He turned it before slowly. She had written reminders about the dietary restrictions of 4 different Haneul Meridian employees, so she could ensure catered meetings accommodated them correctly. She had noted the college application deadlines for the daughter of a loading dock supervisor named Marcus, and beside it, recommendation letter draft by Nov 3. She had written a note about a security guard named Rodriguez who had been working double shifts and whose wife had recently given birth. The note said simply, Rodriguez, overtime check. Make sure it processed. Seok-won turned another page. In the margin of a Thursday, surrounded by meeting times and document reference numbers, she had written 5 words in smaller letters than the rest. The kind of writing a person does when they're noting something for themselves rather than as a task. He never sees any of this. He didn't close the planner. He set it face down on the table and pressed both hands flat against the surface and breathed. She was right, he hadn't. Not the people, not what they carried. Not the accumulated weight of the human machinery that kept Haneul Meridian functioning, the sick wives, the college interviews, the overtime checks, the dietary restrictions, the entire invisible infrastructure of consideration that Zuri had maintained alone, because she understood something he had never bothered to learn, that an organization held together by fear alone is fragile, and what actually keeps people showing up, actually keeps them loyal, is the sense that someone in that building sees them as a person rather than a function. She had been doing his humanity for him, and he had let her. Tae-hyuk arrived at the office at 9:30, which was his normal time. Seok-won watched him cross the executive floor, through the glass of the conference room, unhurried, well-dressed, carrying a leather portfolio and a coffee from the place on the ground floor he preferred. He stopped to exchange a word with one of the junior analysts. He smiled at something. He looked, in every observable way, like a man who had nothing on his mind but an ordinary Tuesday. Seok-won watched him until he disappeared into his office, then looked down at the table. He had known Tae-hyuk for 11 years. He had known Zuri for 8. One of them had spent those years quietly working to protect him. The other had spent them quietly preparing to sell him. At 10:15, Jin-tae knocked and entered without waiting, which was his custom. He closed the door behind him, and his face carried something that wasn't quite urgency, but was in the neighborhood of it. Min-soo found something fast, Jin-tae said. He was already inside the system from the overnight pull. He found a secondary authorization account nested inside the vendor management database. Been active for about 10 months. Whose? On paper, it's registered to a decommissioned IT account, a former network administrator who left the company 18 months ago. But the behavioral pattern of the activity matches Tae-hyuk's usage profile almost exactly. Same access hours, same navigation sequence, same data clusters being accessed. Almost exactly. Close enough that Min-soo says it would hold up under forensic analysis. Seok-won nodded slowly. What was the account accessing? Shipping manifests, specifically the ones tied to our Pacific routing contracts. He was pulling container-level detail weights, routing codes, declared contents, port authority contacts. Pulling it to where? That's the part Min-soo is still working on. But the data was being compiled into packaged exports. And those exports were being pushed to an external server. Seok-won went very still. He was selling our routing intelligence, he said. It was a question. Jin-tae said nothing. To who? Min-soo found a financial transaction chain that he's tracing now. But the counterparty profile matches the operating pattern of Shin Dal-soo's network. Shin Dal-soo. The name landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Shin Dal-soo was a Korean-American criminal organization operator based out of Chicago who had been attempting to expand into East Coast port operations for the past several years. He was not a man Seok-won feared, but he was a man Seok-won had been in a quiet, territorial standoff with, for 18 months, a standoff that had remained cold and functional precisely because neither side had enough operational intelligence about the other to move without risk. If Tae-hyuk had been providing Shin Dal-soo with Haneul Meridian's routing details, their container schedules, their port authority contacts he had been handing over the map. Seok-won pulled his jacket from the back of his chair and stood. Where are you going? Jin-tae asked. To talk to him. That's not. Jin-tae stopped. Started again. That's not tactically sound right now. We don't have the complete picture yet. If you confront him before Min-soo finishes tracing the transaction chain, he'll know we're onto him, and whatever he hasn't moved yet will disappear. I'm not going to confront him, Seok-won said. I'm going to sit across a table from a man who had my secretary kidnapped and abducted and locked in a concrete room for 4 days and look him in the face. Seok-won. I'm not going to touch him. I'm not going to say anything he can use. He straightened his jacket. I just need to look at him. Jin-tae held his ground for a moment longer, then stepped aside. Seok-won walked down the executive corridor and knocked twice on Tae-hyuk's office door before opening it, a courtesy he extended to nobody else on the floor, which meant it wouldn't register as unusual. Tae-hyuk looked up from behind his desk. He was reviewing something on his monitor. Pushed down his nose. And when he saw Seok-won, he straightened slightly and pulled the glasses off with the casual ease of a man who had nothing to hide. Seok-won, I was going to come find you. I heard about Zuri. Any news? She was found last night. She's in medical care. Tae-hyuk's expression shifted into something that looked like relief, concern, the appropriate configuration of emotions for a colleague receiving positive news about a missing employee. He was good at it. He had clearly practiced it. That's a relief, Tae-hyuk said. What happened to her? Was it a random? We're still investigating, Seok-won said. He was leaning slightly against the door frame with his arms at his sides, And he looked at Tae-hyuk the way you look at a painting when you've finally understood what's wrong with it and can't believe it took you so long to see. Tae-hyuk met his eyes without difficulty. He was 52 years old and had spent more than a decade managing the interior life of a criminal organization, and he was very good at looking like a man with nothing to manage. "Whatever you need from my team to support the investigation," Tae-hyuk said. "Just say the word." "I'll remember that," Seok-won said. He held the eye contact for 3 seconds longer than comfortable. Then he said, "Good meeting this morning?" And Tae-hyuk said yes, routine, nothing critical. And Seok-won said good and turned and left. In the corridor, walking back to his conference room, he felt his hands close once into fists at his sides and then open again. Tae-hyuk hadn't flinched, hadn't looked away, hadn't shown anything, which meant he was either genuinely composed or he had no idea how close the walls already were. Either way, Seok-won had seen enough. He made a call from his private office at noon, not from his corporate line, from a cell phone that was registered to a name that didn't connect back to him. He called a number he had used only twice in 3 years. It rang 4 times before a woman answered. "I have materials coming your way," Seok-won said. "Financial records, access logs, a data extraction trail. I'll need them evaluated for federal relevance." A pause. "This is a significant change in approach for you." "Yes. What happened?" "Someone in my organization crossed a line that doesn't get crossed." Another pause. "The same person causing the shipping intelligence leak we've been tracking from the Chicago side?" Seok-won went still. "You've been tracking it for about 6 months. We couldn't locate the source. If you're telling me it's internal to Haneul Meridianites, I'm telling you I'll have documentation that confirms the source, the method, and the counterparty relationship within 48 hours. He paused. "I'm also telling you there was a person harmed in connection with this. A civilian employee. I want that in the record." "Understood." A beat. "You know what this means for you?" "I know what it means. I'll need more than documents. I'll need cooperation." "You'll have it." He ended the call and set the phone on the desk and looked at it for a moment. He had just done something that 24 hours ago would have been unthinkable, reached across the line he had maintained for his entire professional life, not because he had been caught, not because he had no other option, but because Zuri Whitfield had spent 7 years quietly protecting him, and the least he could do was protect her back, even if it cost him everything he'd spent 2 decades building. The irony was not lost on him. She had been the one who had a federal contact. She had been the one carefully managing his exposure. And now he was the one making the call she had been quietly preparing the conditions for, except she couldn't see it, because she was in a hospital bed in Weehawken, unconscious, with cracked ribs and hypothermia and 4 days of lost time that nobody could give back. Min-soo came back to him at 3 p.m. with the completed transaction trace. Tae-hyuk had established 3 shell corporations over the past 2 years, registered in Delaware through different law firms with no obvious connection to each other. The shells had received payments totaling a little over $4 million from a holding company that Min-soo traced through 4 layers of intermediary entities to a financial management firm in Chicago, with known associations to Shin Dal-soo's operation. $4 million. For routing intelligence, port authority contacts, and this was the part that turned Seok-won's stomach, the names and schedules of Haneul Meridian's longshoremen contacts. The people who managed the physical movement of cargo through the docks. If Shin Dal-soo had those names, he didn't just have Haneul Meridian's shipping map. He had the ability to interfere with it. "When did the last payment clear?" Seok-won asked. 6 days ago, 3 days before Zuri disappeared. "Yes." Min-soo set a single page on the table, and this cleared 2 days before that. It was a payment authorization, internal to Haneul Meridian, from the Corporate Operational Expense Fund, routed through the facilities management budget to a contractor account. The amount was $40,000. The contractor account was Meridian Climate Solutions, LLC. Tae-hyuk had paid for the abduction using Haneul Meridian's own money. He had not even bothered to use his personal funds. He had written it against the operational budget, buried in a facilities expense line, confident that nobody would look closely enough to find it, because he had spent 14 months ensuring vendor authorization to ensure that he was the only person who had full visibility into that budget. Except Zuri had been looking. That was what she had found. Not just the shipping intelligence leak, she had found the financial thread. The ghost vendor payments. The pattern that connected Tae-hyuk's authorization signature to a money trail that led directly to the competition. And Tae-hyuk had known she found it, which was why she was in a concrete room with zip ties on her wrists instead of sitting at her desk. "Pull everything," Seok-won said. His voice was flat and final. "Every document, every transaction record, every access log that touches Tae-hyuk's authorization signature. Package it for external handover." Min-soo looked at him. External. Federal. The silence in the room was absolute for a moment. "You're sure?" Min-soo said. "I'm sure. Once we hand that over, we can't—" "I know," Seok-won. Min-soo rarely used his name directly. "This doesn't just end Tae-hyuk. This opens the door. Everything that touches those financial records is going to be visible." "I know what it opens." Min-soo studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "I'll have it packaged by tonight." After he left, Jin-tae came in and sat down across from Seok-won without being invited and put both elbows on the table. "Talk to me," Jin-tae said. "About what?" "About whether you've thought through what you're doing." "I've thought through it. Handing records to federal investigators isn't a surgical move. It's not targeted, whatever they find in those files." "I know what they'll find." "Then you know this isn't just Tae-hyuk's ending." Jin-tae's voice was level, not accusatory. "You've been running this organization for 15 years. There are things in those files that I know." Seok-won looked at him directly. "I know exactly what's in those files, Jin-tae. I built those files. I know every line in them. Then why?" "Because she was in that room for 4 days." His voice didn't rise, didn't crack, but something in it changed a quality underneath the control, something raw and factual. She was in that room for 4 days because she found the thing that Tae-hyuk was afraid of her finding. And instead of coming to me again, she didn't. Because the last time she came to me, I told her to leave it to security. He paused. And security was the problem. Jin-tae was quiet. "She protected this organization," Seok-won said, "for years. Without being asked. Without any acknowledgement. She protected it because she cared about the people in it, not because I deserved it." His jaw tightened slightly. "The least I can do is protect the person she was trying to protect it from." Jin-tae looked at him for a long time. Then the older man leaned back in his chair and looked up at the ceiling. "All right," Jin-tae said finally. "All right, then we do it properly. Not reactive structured. You call the shots on the handover timing, you control the sequence of what goes out and when, and you make sure the federal conversation happens on your terms before anything else moves. That's already in motion." Jin-tae looked at him sharply. "I made the call at noon," Seok-won said. A long beat. "You made the call before you talked to me." "Yes." Jin-tae absorbed this. His face moved through several things in quick succession before settling back into composure. "You trust the contact? I trust the outcome. That's not the same thing." "No," Seok-won agreed. "It's not." At 4:47 p.m., Seok-won received a text from the private number he'd called at noon. 2 words, "Package received." He had sent the first batch of documents, the transaction chain, the Shell Corporation records, the $40,000 payment authorization, through a secure drop that Min-soo had established. It was a small package, a preview, enough to confirm the relevance of what was coming. A sound like green wood splitting, he was putting the documents in order on the conference table, preparing the sequence of the handover, when Min-soo returned and stood in the doorway with an expression that meant something had gone sideways. "Tae-hyuk just submitted a request to the IT department," Min-soo said. "He wants a full backup of his corporate files transferred to an external drive." He cited an audit preparation process. Seok-won looked up. "There's no audit scheduled," Min-soo said. "No, he's moving data." "Yes, which means he knows." Seok-won stood up from the table. Something had shifted in his posture, not aggression exactly, but a finality, the specific quality of a decision being made in real time. "Or he's been planning this extraction for a while, and the timing is coincidental," he said. "Do you believe that?" "No," Seok-won reached for his jacket. "Block the IT request. System maintenance issue, something routine. Buy me 24 hours, and if he pushes back, then we'll know for certain how much he knows. He straightened his jacket. Where's he going after work tonight? Minsu checked his phone. His calendar shows a dinner reservation. A restaurant in Midtown, 7:30. With who? The reservation is under his name. Single party. Seok-won considered this. A man who believed he was under investigation did not make dinner reservations for one. Either Tae-hyuk was genuinely unaware, or the dinner reservation was a cover for something else, and a meeting that wasn't on any calendar with someone whose name Tae-hyuk was not about to put in a system he knew could be monitored. Put someone on him, Seok-won said, from the moment he leaves this building. Already done, Minsu said. Seok-won stopped, looked at him. Since this morning, Minsu said, without apology. Seok-won nodded. Good. He returned to the table. The documents were spread in front of him, $4 million in dirty money, the names of his people sold to a competitor, a $40,000 payment that had sent a woman to a concrete room in Jersey City. Evidence of an 11-year betrayal built one careful authorization at a time, hidden in operational budgets and dissolved shell companies, and 14 months of restructured vendor protocols, all of it constructed by a man who had sat across from Seok-won at his own conference table dozens of times and looked him in the eye with the practiced ease of someone who had long since stopped thinking of him as a threat. Seok-won picked up Zuri's personal planner from the corner of the table where he had left it face down that morning. He opened it to the last entry she had made before she disappeared. It was a to-do list for the following Monday 3 items. A document she needed to prepare, a call she needed to schedule, and at the bottom of the list, circled twice in blue pen, a single line, tell him. Don't wait. She had been going to tell him. She had circled it, reminded herself, decided. And on Friday evening, Kwon Tae-hyuk had walked into her office and looked at her with the flat patience of a man who had already made his decision, and Zuri Whitfield had kept her face still and her voice even, and by Monday morning, the to-do list sat unfinished on a desk where nobody was sitting. Seok-won closed the planner. He sat with the weight of that for exactly as long as he allowed himself, which was not long, because there was work to do, and a man who was currently at his desk 200 feet away, preparing to disappear. And then he set the planner aside and reached for the next document. He had 48 hours before the federal contact would expect a full package. Tae-hyuk had 24 hours before he would realize that the IT block on his file transfer was not routine maintenance. And somewhere in a private medical facility in Weehawken, Zuri Whitfield was breathing steadily in a hospital bed, still unconscious, splitting, still unaware that the man she had spent 7 years quietly protecting was currently dismantling everything he had built in order to make sure that the person who had put her in that room would never have the opportunity to do it to anyone else. She had written, tell him. Don't wait. He was listening. 4 days too late and from the wrong direction, but he was finally completely listening. The IT block held until 7 a.m. the following morning. That was when Tae-hyuk walked directly to the 4th floor server room, bypassed the standard request process, using an emergency override code that was technically within his COO authorization, and began the file transfer himself. Minsu got the alert at 7:04. He called Seok-won at 7:06. Seok-won was already in the building. He had slept 3 hours on the couch in his private office and woken at 5, with the particular alertness of a man whose body understands that rest is over before his mind catches up. He had been at the conference table since 5:30, going through the remaining documents, cross-referencing Tae-hyuk's authorization signature against every vendor payment in the past 24 months with the systematic attention of someone who needed to know the full shape of the thing before he could act on any part of it. He answered Minsu's call on the first ring. He's in the server room, Minsu said. Emergency override. He's moving files right now. How long does the transfer take? At the volume, he's pulling 15 minutes. Maybe 20. Intercept it. If I cut the transfer mid-process, it'll corrupt the files. We lose the data. Can you mirror it first copy what he's pulling before you cut? A short pause. Give me 8 minutes, you have 6. He was out of the conference room before the call ended, walking fast down the executive corridor toward the stairwell. He took the stairs rather than the elevator 4 floors down, stairwell empty, and echoing at an hour, and pushed through the door into the 4th floor corridor with the particular controlled speed of a man who has made a decision and is now simply executing it. The server room was at the end of the hall. Its door was closed, but the indicator light above the frame showed active access someone inside. Seok-won stood outside the door and waited. He could hear the faint mechanical hum of the equipment through the wall. His phone buzzed, Min-soo mirror complete. He opened the door. Tae-hyuk was standing at a workstation terminal in the center of the room, a small external drive plugged into the port, his back to the door. He was dressed for work jacket, tie, the leather portfolio on the floor beside him, and for a fraction of a second, when he heard the door, his shoulders tightened slightly before he turned around, with the composed expression of a man who had prepared for this possibility. Seok-won, he said. Early morning. Cut transfer, Seok-won said. Tae-hyuk looked at the terminal, looked back. I'm pulling audit preparation materials. I told it to you yesterday. There's no audit scheduled. Seok-won stepped into the room and let the door close behind him. Cut it. Tae-hyuk studied him for a moment. The composed expression held professionally, impressively, but something changed underneath it. A recalibration. The expression of a man who had been running 2 separate calculations simultaneously and had just learned that one of them was no longer viable. He reached over and unplugged the drive. What's this about? He said. His voice was even, unhurried. Sit down, I'd rather stand. Tae-hyuk. Seok-won looked at him. Sit down a beat. Then Tae-hyuk pulled a rolling chair from beneath the workstation and sat in it with the deliberate ease of a man demonstrating that he was choosing to comply, not being forced to. Seok-won remained standing. He put his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at Kwon Tae-hyuk, the reading glasses still folded in his breast pocket, the silver at his temples, the careful stillness of a man who had spent a decade learning how to be invisible inside someone else's organization and said nothing for long enough that the silence became its own kind of pressure. Meridian Climate Solutions, Seok-won said. Tae-hyuk's face didn't move. $40,000, Seok-won said. Operational expense budget. Facilities line. Authorized by your account code. I authorize hundreds of vendor payments. That company was dissolved 14 months ago. Tae-hyuk said nothing. The man they sent had a forged badge. He drove a van out of our underground garage at 6:36 p.m. on Tuesday. Seok-won's voice remained conversational. Almost quiet. He had a passenger. The silence in the server room was different now. The equipment hum seemed louder. You paid $40,000 of this company's money, Seok-won said, to have my secretary kidnapped and locked in an abandoned building in Jersey City. Tae-hyuk looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not guilt exactly, more like the final releasing of a pretense that had become exhausting to maintain. He uncrossed his legs and leaned forward slightly with his elbows on his knees, and when he spoke again, the composed professional register was gone, and what replaced it was something rawer and more honest. She found the vendor accounts, he said. Yes, I gave her 2 weeks to let it go. I thought she'd pull back once she understood what she was looking at. She didn't pull back. A pause. She never did she? What was your plan? Seok-won asked, after she was gone. What did you tell yourself happened next? Tae-hyuk was quiet for a moment. She was supposed to disappear long enough for me to finish the extraction. Move the remaining funds, close the shells, cover the routing intelligence transfers. By the time anyone found her, there'd be nothing left to trace. And Zuri herself? Tae-hyuk met his eyes. She wasn't supposed to be harmed. The sound Seok-won made was barely audible, not a laugh, something shorter and colder than that. She had cracked ribs. She was in hypothermia. She was in that room for 4 days. The contractor wasn't supposed to. Tae-hyuk stopped, pressed his lips together. That wasn't the instruction. But that's what happened. Yes. The word sat in the room. Tae-hyuk said it without looking away, which Seok-won noted, not because it suggested remorse, but because it suggested a man who had decided that the performance was over, and whatever came next would be faced straight on. How long? Seok-won said. Since the beginning. Seok-won went very still. The referral, Tae-hyuk said. The contact who brought me to you 11 years ago. He was Shin Dal-soo's man. Has been for 15 years. The introduction was engineered. He paused. I was placed here. The room's hum seemed to contract. 11 years. Not a defection. Not a loyalty that had corroded over time, under the pressure of money or resentment. Placement. A deliberate, patient, 11-year infiltration, built on a referral from a man Seok-won had trusted, designed to embed a source inside Haneul Meridian at the executive level and wait. The contact, Seok-won said. His voice was very controlled. The man who referred you, Kim Byung-soo, Tae-hyuk said. The name hit him like cold water. Kim Byung-soo had been part of Seok-won's network since before Haneul Meridian existed, one of the original contacts from his early years in New York, a man who had smoothed introductions, opened doors, vouched for people. He had died of a stroke 4 years ago. Or Seok-won had been told he'd died of a stroke. Is he alive? Seok-won said. Tae-hyuk hesitated for just a fraction of a second. I don't know. I haven't had direct contact with him in 3 years. Dal-soo's structure is compartmentalized. I received instructions through intermediaries. What instructions? Patience, mostly. Don't move until the routing contracts reached a certain volume. Don't move until the port authority relationships were mature enough to be worth selling. He looked at his hands. It took 8 years before the intelligence was worth what Dal-soo would pay for it. 8 years of patience. 8 years of sitting in meetings, approving documents, building trust, attending quarterly reviews, sending a bottle of whiskey at the new year. 8 years of waiting for the right moment to begin the extraction. Seok-won pulled his phone out of his pocket. What are you doing? Tae-hyuk said. Calling the people who are going to take you out of this building. Federal? Yes. Tae-hyuk nodded slowly. He looked unsurprised. He looked, if anything, like a man who had spent the past 24 hours running his own calculations and had arrived at the same endpoint from a different direction. There's something you need to know before you make that call, Tae-hyuk said. There's nothing you have that changes what happens next. Jin-tae knew. Seok-won's thumb stopped above the screen. Not everything, Tae-hyuk said. Not Dal-soo. Not the full scope. But he knew about the shell vendors. He found the first one 2 years ago, when he was reviewing a quarterly report. Came to me privately. He paused. We reached an arrangement. Seok-won did not move. He took a one-time payment, Tae-hyuk said. $250,000, routed through a real estate holding company he already owned. In exchange, he told me what he'd found and buried it. He never looked again. Another pause. He also told me when your federal contact first reached out to you, 6 months ago. He doesn't know who the contact is, but he knew the conversation happened. The room tilted slightly, not physically, but in the way the world tilts when a fixed point you've been navigating by turns out to have been moving the entire time. Baek Jin-tae, 60 years old, 20 years beside him. The man who had sat in the ICU waiting room until 3A. The man who had said she's going to be all right, like it meant something. The man who had held his ground about the tactical soundness of confronting Tae-hyuk too early, which now read differently, not as strategic caution, but as the specific concern of a man who needed Tae-hyuk to remain in play long enough to finish covering his own involvement. And the fraction of a beat before he'd said, understood when Seok-won told him not to tell Tae-hyuk. He had filed that away. He had noticed it and moved past it because 20 years of loyalty didn't dissolve in a breath's worth of hesitation. Except it already had dissolved 2 years ago, in a private conversation in an office, somewhere in this building, when Jin-tae had taken $250,000 and decided that his comfort was worth more than his honesty. Seok-won put his phone back in his pocket. He walked to the door of the server room, opened it, and stood in the frame. The 4th floor corridor was empty. He looked down its length, the fluorescent lights, the closed doors, the utterly ordinary institutional quiet of an office building, before the workday properly begins. Don't move, he said to Tae-hyuk without turning around. He pulled the door shut from the outside. He walked to the end of the corridor and stood at the window. There it overlooked a courtyard between 2 wings of the building. A narrow strip of gray morning with a single tree that had lost most of its leaves. And he stood with one hand against the glass, and breathed. 20 years. Not 11, 20. 2 decades of proximity, of trust constructed day by day, of a man who knew things about Seok-won's operation that no external enemy could have accessed, who had been present for decisions that had shaped the entire architecture of Haneul Meridian's legitimate and illegitimate functions. 2 decades of Jin Tae at his right hand, and somewhere inside those 20 years, at a specific moment 2 years ago, he had made a calculation and decided that $250,000 was sufficient reason to stop being the person Seok-won believed him to be. And then he had sat in a hospital waiting room at 3A and said she's going to be all right with exactly the right expression. Seok-won's hand pressed harder against the glass. He called Min-soo. Where's Jin Tae right now? His office. He arrived about 20 minutes ago. Don't let him leave the floor. Don't tell him why. Find a reason, something routine. Do it quietly. Pause. Just do it. And bring Cho Hyun-ji and 2 of your people to the 4th floor server room. Now, he ended the call. He stayed at the window for 30 more seconds. The tree in the courtyard moved slightly in a wind he couldn't feel through the glass. He watched it and let the fullness of what had just happened settle into him, not the emotional weight of it, not yet, but the structural reality. The map of everything he'd believed about his own organization had just been redrawn in a matter of minutes. 2 major nodes, not one. An infiltration that had started before Haneul Meridian was what it was today. A trusted inner circle that had been compromised at its center and its right hand simultaneously. And Zuri had been trying to tell him. She had found the financial thread, the vendor irregularities, the ghost payments, and she had tried to bring it to him. And when he had dismissed her, she had gone to her desk and opened her planner and written, "Tell him." Don't wait, and circled it twice, because she knew it was important enough to override whatever reluctance she felt. And then Tae-hyuk had walked through her door at 5:47 p.m. and looked at her with that flat patience, and the whole thing had ended before it had a chance to begin. She hadn't known about Jin Tae. He was almost certain of that. The files she kept, the system she'd maintained, it was focused on vendor irregularities, external threats, financial patterns. Jin Tae's involvement had been a single private conversation and a buried payment, the kind of thing that wouldn't surface in the records Zuri had access to. It had been invisible enough that even Seok-won, now looking back through 2 years of interactions with clear eyes, couldn't identify a specific moment where he should have known. That was the most precise kind of betrayal. The kind that doesn't announce itself. He returned to the server room. Tae-hyuk had not moved from the rolling chair. He had in fact taken out his phone and was looking at the screen with the patience of a man waiting for a bus. He looked up when Seok-won entered. Jin Tae, Seok-won said. Was his involvement his own initiative, or was he directed by Dal-soo? His own. Tae-hyuk set the phone face down on his knee. He wasn't part of the original placement. He found the vendor discrepancy independently and made his own decision about what to do with it. Dal-soo doesn't even know he exists as a factor. How do you know that? Because I told Dal-soo I handled the discrepancy through an internal accounting correction. I didn't tell him about Jin Tae. He was useful as an asset, and Dal-soo would have wanted to leverage him further in ways that would have increased the risk profile. So Tae-hyuk had kept Jin Tae private, had managed him as a personal insurance policy rather than a shared resource, had paid for his silence and then controlled the information about his involvement because sharing it would have introduced variables Tae-hyuk couldn't predict. The federal package I'm handing over, Seok-won said. Does it include the Jin Tae payment? Tae-hyuk tilted his head slightly. You'd have to ask Min-soo what he found. The payment was routed carefully, but Min-soo is good. He found everything else. Then probably yes. Min-soo arrived with Hyun-ji and 2 security personnel 4 minutes later. So Seok-won met them in the corridor, gave Min-soo a version of what had happened that covered the essential points: Tae-hyuk's confession, the planted intelligence, the real estate transaction, and watched Min-soo's face go through several adjustments as he processed the Jin Tae element. Jin Tae, Min-soo said quietly. The word came out like something he was testing the weight of. Has he attempted to leave the floor? No. Yoon-gi has him in a conversation about the Q4 logistics review. He doesn't know anything's wrong yet. Good. Seok-won looked at the two security personnel. Keep Kwon Tae-hyuk in that server room. Don't touch him. Don't threaten him. Just make sure he stays there until the federal contact sends a team. When will that be? I'll make the call in 10 minutes. He pulled Min-soo aside while the two security men entered the server room. He spoke quietly, close, with the focus of a man trying to build a structure quickly before the wind picks up. The Jinte payment, you need to tell me exactly what you found and what format it's in. Min-soo pulled out his phone and opened a document. Real estate holding company, registered to his wife's maiden name. Payment received in 2 tranches, 150,000 and then 100,000, about 6 weeks apart 2 years ago. The source is traced to a sub-account of one of Tae-hyuk's Delaware shells. Is it clean enough for federal use? It'll require some additional forensic accounting to make the chain airtight, but the core transaction is documented. Yes. Add it to the package. Min-soo hesitated. Just slightly. He's been with you 20 years. Add it to the package, Min-soo. Yes. Seok-won walked back down the corridor, took the stairs up to the executive floor, and went to his office. He sat at his desk, not the conference table, his actual desk, the one he had worked at for 8 years, the one where he had approved countless documents and taken countless calls and built the organization that currently contained at least 2 men who had been working against him for longer than he'd understood. And he made the call. The federal contact answered on the second ring. I need to accelerate the timeline, Seok-won said. I have the primary subject secured on site, and I have a second subject who needs to be brought in simultaneously. If they make contact with each other in the next hour, the integrity of the financial evidence chain becomes compromised. Simultaneous apprehension requires a team and a warrant. You have enough for the warrant in the package I sent last night. The second subject is Baek Jin-tae, listed as senior strategist in the Haneul Meridian organizational documents. His role is documented in the same financial chain. Pause. Longer than the previous ones. You're turning over your entire executive structure. Yes. I want to make sure I understand what you're offering here, because it changes the scope of what we can. I understand what it changes, Seok-won said. I need the team here within 90 minutes. Another pause. 90 minutes. Yes. All right. He ended the call. He sat in his chair and looked at his office, the room he had occupied for 8 years, built around the kind of restrained precision that reflected how he preferred to move through the world. Clean desk, good light, nothing ornamental except a single photograph on the credenza behind him that he didn't look at now. In 90 minutes, federal investigators would walk into this building. They would take Kwon Tae-hyuk out of a server room in handcuffs. They would walk down the executive corridor and open the door to Baek Jin-tae's office, while Jin-tae was still talking about Q4 logistics. And the expression on Jin-tae's face when he understood what was happening was something Seok-won was deliberately not trying to imagine. And after that, the conversation about Haneul Meridian itself would begin. The conversation Seok-won had been avoiding for 15 years about the shipping infrastructure, the port authority arrangements, the cargo that moved through Pacific routes without complete documentation. The federal contact had been careful not to specify the scope of what cooperation would require, but Seok-won was not naive about what I need the team here in 90 minutes, and you're turning over your entire executive structure would set in motion. There was a knock at his door. He already knew who it was before it opened. The knock was wrong, slightly hesitant, a fraction too soft, the knock of a man who was not entirely sure of his welcome. Jin-tae opened the door and stood in the frame. He was dressed the same as always, jacket, pressed shirt, the reading glasses he'd started wearing 2 years ago hanging from his breast pocket. His face was composed and familiar, and now that Seok-won was looking at it with full information, contained a specific tension around the eyes that had probably always been there and that Seok-won had simply attributed to age or the general weight of difficult work. Hyun-gi said you wanted to see me, Jin-tae said. Seok-won looked at him for a long moment. Close the door, he said. Jin-tae closed it and came forward and took the chair across the desk, the same chair he'd occupied 100 times. Easy and familiar, the posture of a man who belonged in this room. Seok-won said Tae-hyuk told me about the arrangement. The composure didn't break, it adjusted. A fraction of a shift in the quality of Jin-tae's stillness, from the stillness of a man at rest to the stillness of a man who has stopped moving, because movement has suddenly become very complicated. How much did he tell you? Jin-tae said. His voice was level. Genuinely level, not performed the steadiness of someone who had also spent 20 years learning how to inhabit a controlled register. Enough, a long beat. It was one decision, Jin-tae said. One moment 2 years ago. I found the vendor account, I went to him privately, and I made a decision I shouldn't have made. His jaw shifted slightly. Everything before that was real. 20 years of it. I know. Then you know that one decision doesn't. Jin-tae, Seok-won's voice was quiet and final. I know. Older man stopped. I know 20 years was real, Seok-won said. I know you didn't place Tae-hyuk. I know you didn't know the full scope of what he was doing. I know the $250,000 was a single moment where you made the wrong choice for reasons that probably made sense at the time. He paused. I know all of that. Jin-tae looked at him. Something in his face had shifted, the composure was still there, but behind it was something exhausted and exposed. The expression of a man who has been carrying a weight for 2 years and has just been told he no longer needs to pretend it isn't there. Federal investigators are arriving in less than 90 minutes, Seok-won said. Your transaction is in the financial package. The chain is documented. Jin-tae closed his eyes briefly. Open them, all right. I need you to remain in this building until they arrive. I'm not going to run. I know you're not. They looked at each other across the desk. 20 years of proximity, of shared decisions, of a relationship built on the specific intimacy of people who operate in dangerous spaces and rely on each other's competence to survive, all of it present in the room, and all of it in the process of becoming something it would never return from. The woman, Jin-tae said. Zuri, she's going to be all right? Yes. I didn't know he was going to. He stopped. I want you to know I didn't know that was coming. I believe you, but I knew what he was doing, in general terms. And I let it continue, yes. Jin-tae looked at his hands on his knees. I'm sorry. The words sat between them with the weight of everything they couldn't fix. I know, Seok-won said. He stood up from his desk and walked to the window, the same window he'd stood at on the morning. Zuri disappeared when he'd looked down at the Hudson and told himself she was probably sick and stood with his back to Jin-tae for a moment. Outside the city was fully awake. The streets below were dense with the ordinary machinery of a Wednesday morning. Trucks, pedestrians, the geometry of a city that had no idea that inside this glass tower, the entire architecture of the past 20 years was in the process of being taken apart piece by piece. Not by an outside force, but by the man who had built it. He heard Jin-tae stand from the chair. I'll wait in my office, Jin-tae said. Seok-won didn't turn around. There'll be someone with you. I understand. Footsteps to the door, a pause. Seok-won, Jin-tae's voice, from behind him, carried something he couldn't entirely classify, not quite remorse, not quite appeal, something in between that had no clean name. What you're doing today? Turning this over. All of it a beat. The right thing. Seok-won kept looking at the city below. I know. The door opened and closed. He stood at the window and waited for the sound of Jin-tae's footsteps to recede down the corridor. And when the floor was quiet again, he put one hand against the glass and pressed his forehead against it, and stood there for a moment with the cold of the window against his skin and the noise of the city coming through it, muffled and distant. The man he had built this organization with. The man who had known about the betrayal for 2 years and buried it for a price. And in a hospital in Weehawken, the woman who had found the thread and tried to pull it and paid for it with 4 days in a concrete room. He had 83 minutes before the federal team arrived. He had an organization that was about to be turned inside out. He had a boardroom full of executives who would arrive at their desks in the next hour with no idea that the ground had already shifted beneath their feet, and who would spend the rest of the day learning that the man at the top of their company had dismantled over their heads, not because he was forced to, but because a 33-year-old woman with cracked ribs and a planner full of other people's problems had spent 7 years trying to tell him this was the only direction anything could go, and he had finally comprehensively, run out of reasons not to listen. He straightened up from the window. He took a breath. He went back to his desk and opened his laptop and began drafting the statement he would read to his senior executive team in 45 minutes before the federal team arrived. Not after, because that was the minimum he owed the people in this building who had done nothing wrong. The truth, delivered by him, while he was still the one standing in the room. He owed them that much. He owed Zuri considerably more, and the distance between what he owed and what he could actually repay was something he was going to have to learn to live with for a very long time. He started typing. The executive team arrived between 8:15 and 8:40, the way they always did, staggered, unhurried, carrying coffee and phones and the particular energy of people who believed the day ahead was manageable. Seok-won had them in the boardroom by 8:50. There were 11 of them around the table, 7 department heads, 2 regional directors, the general counsel, and the head of HR. A woman named Park Soo-yeon who had been with Haneul Meridian for 9 years and who took one look at Seok-won when she walked in and quietly put her phone face down on the table without being asked. Nobody asked where Jin-tae was. Nobody asked where Tae-hyuk was. Seok-won stood at the head of the table and did not sit down. He had the statement on a single printed page in front of him. He had written it in 40 minutes and not revised it, because revision was a way of softening things that didn't deserve to be softened. What I'm about to tell you, he began, is going to change the nature of this organization, fundamentally and permanently. Some of you will have questions I can't answer yet. Some of you will have concerns about your own exposure. Those concerns are legitimate, and I'll address them individually after this meeting. He paused. But first, I'm going to tell you the truth, and I need you to hear it from me before you hear it from anyone else. Told them. Not everything, not the full architecture of the criminal infrastructure, not the precise contours of what the federal investigation would eventually surface, but the essential structure, Tae-hyuk's infiltration, the intelligence sales, the shell corporations, the abduction of Zuri Whitfield as a mechanism for suppressing what she'd discovered, and the federal team that was arriving in approximately 65 minutes. He told them about Jin-tae. He told them that he was cooperating fully. The room was very quiet throughout. Not the nervous quiet of people trying to decide how to react, but the specific stillness of people processing something that has altered the basic coordinates of their professional reality. Park Soo-yeon had her hands flat on the table and her eyes on the surface between them. The general counsel, a Korean-American man named Lim Jae-won, who wore his composure like a physical garment and almost never showed anything at board level, had taken off his glasses and was holding them in one hand with the quiet concentration of someone who needed an object to grip. When Seok-won finished, Jae-won put his glasses back on. The scope of federal cooperation, Jae-won said carefully. You said full. I need to understand what that means operationally. It means everything they ask for, including the non-declared cargo arrangements. Yes, a beat. That's going to create significant exposure for the companies. I know what it creates, Seok-won said. I need the legal team working with federal counsel starting today. Not defensively, cooperatively. There's a distinction, and I need you to maintain it. Jae-won looked at him steadily. Understood. Anyone in this room who feels their own exposure requires independent legal counsel should make that call this morning. I'm not asking for loyalty over self-preservation. You have families. Make the call if you need to. He looked down the table. But nobody in this room had advanced knowledge of Tae-hyuk's operation or Jin-tae's arrangement. If that's true, and I believe it is, then your cooperation is a protection, not a liability. Park Soo-yeon looked up from the table. Zuri Whitfield, she said. Where is she now? She's in medical care. She's stable. What does she need from us? The question was so direct and so practically focused that it landed differently from everything else in the room. Seok-won looked at her. Right now she needs to recover, he said. When she's ready to think about what comes next, she'll tell us. I want to be the one who calls her, Park Soo-yeon said. Not a lawyer, not a formal communication me. All right. He dismissed the executive team at 9:22 and returned to his office to wait. The federal team arrived at 9. 47-4 agents and a supervising officer named Darren Walsh, a lean, methodical man in his mid-40s, whose handshake was businesslike, and whose eyes moved across everything in a room, with the efficient coverage of someone trained to read environments quickly. He had 2 assistants with him carrying document cases and a forensic IT specialist who went directly to the 4th floor without speaking to anyone. Walsh sat across from Seok-won in the conference room. "Your package was thorough," Walsh said. "There's more." "There always is." Seok-won told him about Tae-hyuk's confession, the placement, Kim Byung-soo's role as the original contact, the 11-year infiltration architecture. Walsh listened without writing anything down, which meant he was recording, which Seok-won had assumed and didn't object to. When Seok-won finished, Walsh said, "The Shin-Dal-soo connection is significant. We've been working that network from the Chicago end for about 3 years. This is the first domestic source we've had with direct operational knowledge. Tae-hyuk's knowledge of Dal-soo's structure is compartmentalized," Seok-won said. "He received instructions through intermediaries, but he has names and financial patterns that should allow you to move up the chain. He'll need to talk to us directly." "He'll talk." Seok-won paused. "He made his decision when I walked into that server room this morning. He's been waiting to be caught for long enough that there's a degree of relief in it. He'll talk." Walsh nodded, and the second subject baked Jin-tae. "His exposure is narrower, a single payment for deliberate concealment. But his knowledge of this organization's operational history is comprehensive, and that has value. For you or for us?" Seok-won looked at him. "For both." Walsh almost smiled. "You've thought this through." "I've had time." The arrests happened without incident, which was both appropriate and slightly surreal. Tae-hyuk was walked out of the server room by 2 federal agents at 10:23 in the morning, while the 4th floor was still occupied by a dozen Haneul Meridian employees who watched through glass partitions with the stunned attention of people, watching something happen that they will spend years describing to other people. He walked without resistance, his leather portfolio still on the floor of the server room where he'd left it, his jacket still buttoned, his expression composed in the way of a man whose principal effort now was the management of his own dignity. Jin-tae was different. Seok-won was at the end of the executive corridor when they brought Jin-tae out of his office, and he saw it from 40 feet away the moment Jin-tae came through his office door between 2 agents and looked down the corridor, and found Seok-won standing there, and their eyes met, and for a moment neither of them moved. Jin-tae's face did something complicated. Not a collapse, he was too controlled for that, but a movement through several things, in rapid sequence, like a man reviewing a long document and finding that the last page reads differently than he expected. He held Seok-won's gaze for 2 or 3 seconds, and in those seconds there was something that Seok-won recognized from 20 years of proximity. Jin-tae was not surprised. He had known this was coming from the moment Seok-won had told him the federal team was arriving. He had gone to his office and sat there and waited, and now he was walking toward the elevator, with a composure that was the last thing he had left to offer. When he passed Seok-won, he didn't stop walking. "You still owe me dinner," Jin-tae said quietly, without turning his head. A reference to something from 2 years ago, a bet they'd made about a baseball game that Seok-won had won and never collected on. Seok-won said nothing. He watched Jin-tae reach the elevator and step inside and disappear behind the closing doors, and then he stood in the empty corridor and felt the specific weight of a grief that had no clean category. At 11:15, Seok-won's phone buzzed with a number he recognized. Min-soo answered before Seok-won could speak. "We have a problem." "What?" Dal-soo knows. Min-soo's voice was controlled but had an edge beneath it. One of the intermediaries, Tae-hyuk, used to route the intelligence he had a failsafe. An automatic notification triggered if his communication pattern went dark for more than 12 hours. Tae-hyuk's account went dark when we locked down the server room this morning. The timeline assembled itself in Seok-won's mind in about 3 seconds. Dal-soo knows Tae-hyuk's been taken, and he knows the federal package exists. He doesn't know exactly what's in it, but he knows enough to understand that the shipping intelligence fint he paid $4 million for is now compromised. What does he do with that? He burns everything connected to it, Min-soo said. He will have already started. Offshore accounts, shell company records, port contacts, anything that creates a link between his network and Haneul Meridian. How long does that take him? Most of it? Hours. But there's one thing he can't burn remotely. What? The longshoreman contacts, the names and schedules Tae-hyuk sold him. Those aren't paper records. They're operational relationships. Active people. Dalsu doesn't burn those by closing accounts. He burns those by making the people unavailable, Seok-won said. There are 9 names in the intelligence package. 3 of them are active contacts at the Port Newark facility. If Dalsu moves against them to sever the connection before federal investigators can reach them, those men become liabilities he needs to eliminate. Yes. Seok-won was already moving toward the elevator. Which 3? Min-soo gave him the names. 2 supervisors and a dock coordinator men who had worked with Haneul Meridian's shipping operations for years and who had received compensation for their cooperation without fully understanding what that cooperation ultimately served. They were not criminal operators. They were working people who had been paid to look the other way on certain manifests, and they had named since and so, and now they were names on a list that a man in Chicago was looking at and calculating the cost of removing. Can you reach them directly? Seok-won said. I have contact numbers. I don't know if they'll pick up from a Haneul Meridian number. They may have already been warned off. Tell Walsh, right now, he needs to get federal protection on those 3 men before Dalsu can move. I'm telling him while I'm talking to you. The elevator doors opened on the lobby. Seok-won stepped out and walked through the lobby past the security desk, where the guard looked up and started to say something, past the glass doors, out onto the street because the building suddenly felt like a container, and he needed the open air and the particular physical reality of pavement and traffic noise to think clearly. His phone buzzed again. Different number. A Port Newark contact, not one of the 3, a different supervisor named Torres, who had been managing the facility's Eastern Loading Coordination for 6 years and whose relationship with Haneul Meridian was entirely legitimate. Mr. Han Torres's voice was tight. Something's wrong down here. There were 2 men, not our guys, not Port Authority, asking about Marcus and Lee, the day supervisors. Someone showed them a photo of each man and asked their shift schedules. Seok-won's jaw tightened. When? 20 minutes ago. Maybe 30. I didn't know if I should call, but then Martinez said he saw the same 2 guys near the East Gate, and where are Marcus and Lee right now? Marcus is in the main facility. Lee called in sick this morning. Lee called in sick. Yeah, about an hour ago. Said his kid had a fever. But get Marcus out of the facility, right now. Take him to your office, lock the door, and call the Port Newark Port Authority police. Tell them you have a security threat. Use those words exactly. Do not let Marcus leave that building until law enforcement is with him. What the hell is? Torres. Do it now. I'll explain everything later, but you need to do it right now. He heard Torres moving, heard him calling Marcus's name across some background distance, heard a door and then footsteps, and then Torres's voice came back closer and more controlled. Okay, we're moving. What about Lee? Seok-won ended the call and immediately called Min-soo back. Lee called in sick this morning. Find out if that was him or if someone called for him. Get his home address to Walsh's team immediately. He may already be in contact with Dalsu's people. On it. A pause, Seok-won. The 3rd contact, the dock coordinator Reyes. He's not answering his phone. Seok-won stopped walking. He was standing on the sidewalk outside Haneul Meridian's building, the mid-morning city moving around him in its continuous indifferent flow, and he felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. How long has he been unreachable? His last phone activity was at 7:40 this morning. Before the server room. Before the IT block. Before any of this had surfaced. Dalsu moved last night, Seok-won said. That's what I'm thinking. Which meant the notification failsafe was either not the trigger, or it had activated earlier than Min-soo had calculated, and this was the version that sat worst. Tae-hyuk had a separate channel he hadn't disclosed. Something that had gone active when the IT block registered the previous evening and sent a signal that hadn't depended on the 12-hour communication gap at all. Tell Walsh about Reyes, Seok-won said, missing since 7:40. I want a location trace on his phone. He went back inside. Walsh was in the conference room with two of his agents and a laptop. And when Seok-won entered, he looked up with the contained urgency of a man who had already received several pieces of accelerating information in the past 10 minutes and was integrating them in real time. The Reyes situation, Seok-won said. We're on it. Phone trace is running. Walsh looked at him. Your source was right that Dal-soo would move fast. He's been doing this a long time. Can you find Reyes in time? Walsh was quiet for a moment, a professional quiet, calibrated and honest. We're trying. That's not an answer. No, Walsh said. It's not. Seok-won put his hands on the back of the nearest chair and stood there for a moment. In the next room, the forensic IT specialist was working through Haneul Meridian server contents. Down in the Federal Processing Facility, somewhere in Lower Manhattan, Tae-hyuk and Jin-tae were beginning conversations that would unfold over days and weeks and produce documents and depositions, and eventually a case that federal prosecutors would spend months assembling. And somewhere in the geography of the city, a dockside street in Newark, a parking lot, Spalakin, an apartment a man named Reyes, who had accepted money to look away from certain shipping manifests, was either running or hiding, or already past the point where running or hiding would have helped. Seok-won straightened. I'm going to Port Newark, he said. Walsh looked up sharply. That's not— I have contacts in that facility that your people don't. People who won't open doors for federal badges, but who will open them for me. He held Walsh's gaze. I'm not going to interfere with your operation. I'm going to find out what I can find out and report it to you directly. You have my phone number, Mr. Han. Walsh. He pulled his jacket straight. Tae-hyuk sold my people to a man in Chicago. 3 of them are in danger right now because of intelligence I was responsible for protecting. I need to do something useful. Walsh looked at him for a long moment. Don't touch anyone. I'm not there to touch anyone. If you encounter any of Dal-soo's people, I'll call you. Walsh held the stare for another second, then looked back at his laptop. Go. He was in a car heading toward the turnpike by 11:40. Min-soo was in the passenger seat. Seok-won hadn't invited him, but he had appeared at the car door and gotten in, which amounted to the same thing. Neither of them spoke for the first several minutes, the city giving way to the industrial corridor south of Newark, the landscape flattening into the particular gray utility of port infrastructure. Min-soo's phone went twice. He spoke in short sentences and listened more than he talked. Reyes's phone last pinged a tower near the Port Newark perimeter at 7:52 a.m., he said. Then nothing. Walsh's team is at his apartment. His wife says he left for work at 7:15 as normal. She hasn't heard from him. He made it to the port area and then went dark. Yes, which means whoever met him was already there. They knew his arrival time, his route, his routine. The intelligence package Tae-hyuk sold it was that specific? Apparently. Seok-won looked out the window at the flat gray expanse of the meadowlands passing slide the highway. Dal-soo didn't buy a map. He bought a daily schedule. Min-soo's phone buzzed a third time. He looked at it, and his expression shifted into something tighter. Yoongi, he said. He's been running a secondary trace on the financial chain, the Dal-soo connection. He found a property registration. A logistics warehouse near the port perimeter registered 18 months ago through a holding company linked to the same financial management firm in Chicago. Seok-won turned to look at him. Dal-soo has a facility at the port, within 2 miles of the eastern gate. Send the address to Walsh. Already done. Min-soo set the phone down. Walsh's team is 12 minutes out. We're 8. Min-soo looked at him. We're closer, Seok-won said. We're also not federal agents with a warrant. No, Seok-won agreed. We're not. They found the facility. 6 minutes later, a low concrete warehouse set back from a service road that ran parallel to the port's eastern perimeter fence. No signage. 2 vehicles in the lot, a dark sedan and a commercial van, kind with no rear windows. The lot was otherwise empty. A loading dock door on the south face, closed. 2 ground-level windows, both covered from the inside. Seok-won told his driver to stop 200 meters short of the lot. He got out of the car and stood on the service road and looked at the building. The air smelled of diesel and salt water and the particular industrial cold of proximity to moving cargo. Somewhere beyond the perimeter fence, heavy equipment moved with the low mechanical thunder of a working port in the middle of its day. Min-soo was beside him. Walsh is 7 minutes out. Someone might not have 7 minutes. Seok-won. Min-soo's voice was flat and careful. We do not go in there. I'm not going in. Then what? I'm going to stand here and wait, Seok-won said, and watch that building. And if anyone comes out of it before Walsh arrives, I'm going to make sure they don't go anywhere. Min-soo looked at him. That's still, I know what it is. 2 minutes passed. The building showed nothing, no movement, no sound beyond the ambient port noise. The dark sedan in the lot hadn't moved. Seok-won stood in the service road with his hands at his sides and his eyes on the loading dock door, and the specific quality of his attention was not rage. It was colder and more precise than that. The focused stillness of a man who had spent 20 years making consequential decisions under pressure and who understood that the variable he could not afford right now was his own reaction time. Then the loading dock door moved. It opened 3 feet, not all the way, just enough, and a man appeared in the gap. He was looking out at the lot, not at the service road, checking the perimeter from the inside. He stood there for about 4 seconds, then reached back into the darkness behind him. Seok-won's phone was already at his ear. Walsh. Loading dock door, south face. Someone's moving. 2 minutes, Walsh said. His voice had changed sharper, operational. You don't have 2 minutes. A second figure appeared in the dock doorway. Then between them, half supported, a third smaller, moving badly, head down, feet dragging slightly on the concrete threshold of the loading dock. Not walking independently, being moved. Seok-won was already crossing the lot. Behind him, Min-soo said something sharp and urgent that he heard but didn't process. And then Min-soo was moving too, because that was Min-soo's nature, not to stop things from happening, but to be present while they did. The 2 men at the loading dock saw him when he was 30 meters out. The one on the left reacted first, a quick, professional assessment, posture changing from watchful to ready in the span of a single breath. The one on the right held his position and maintained his grip on the man between them, which told Seok-won immediately which of them was the operational lead and which was the muscle. He kept walking. Let him go, Seok-won said. His voice came out flat and entirely without performance. Not loud, the distance required volume, but he kept it low anyway. The kind of voice that carries not because of its force, but because of its texture. The left man said something in Korean, a warning, clipped and impersonal. Seok-won stopped 8 meters from the dock, close enough to see the face of the man between them, mid-40s, dark-skinned, work clothes, a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled and then stopped. Reyes. Conscious but barely, his weight shifted mostly onto the man to his right, his eyes finding Seok-won with a focus that was working hard to hold. Federal investigators are 90 seconds out, Seok-won said to the 2 men. Not a threat, a fact, delivered in the same register. When they arrive, you can either be standing here holding him, or you can be gone. I don't care which. The operational lead on the right looked past him, scanning the service road, the perimeter, calculating. But he stays, Seok-won said. Whatever else you decide, he stays here. A long beat. The sound of vehicles on the service road moving fast, more than one. The right side man released his grip on Reyes, stepped back into the darkness of the warehouse interior, and disappeared. The left man followed him. The dock door began to roll shut. Reyes dropped. Seok-won covered the remaining 8 meters in about 3 seconds and went to his knees on the concrete beside Reyes as the man's legs gave out completely. He caught him under the arms, the weight of a full-grown man in work, clothes heavier than expected, the warmth of someone who had been through something physical and was running on the heat of it. Reyes made a sound that wasn't quite words, his hands finding Seok-won's forearms and gripping. I've got you, Seok-won said. Stay down, stay down. They're coming. Tires on the service road. Doors. Voices with the specific cadence of trained personnel moving fast toward a target. Walsh's voice calling out, and then agents splitting toward the dock door and toward the 2 of them on the concrete. An agent reached Seok-won and Reyes and went straight into assessment mode, hands on Reyes, checking pulse, checking the head wound, calling something back over his shoulder. Seok-won sat back on his heels on the concrete dock of a Shindalsu warehouse in the shadow of the Port Newark perimeter fence and looked at his own hands. His palms were scraped from the concrete. His jacket was going to need cleaning. Walsh appeared above him. "You said you weren't going in," Walsh said. "I didn't go in." Walsh looked at Reyes being stabilized by the agent. Looked back at Seok-won. "The two men in the warehouse, they're gone. There'll be a secondary exit in the back." "I know." "You let them go." "I let them make a decision," Seok-won said. "They made the right one." Walsh was quiet for a moment. "Then the other two, Marcus and Lee. Port Authority has Marcus. Lee appears to have had advance warning. His wife got a call early this morning and they relocated. He's been in contact with Dal Su's network directly. Lee was working both sides. Appears so." Walsh crouched down so they were closer to eye level. His voice dropped. "This is going to extend beyond what we originally discussed. Dal Su's footprint here is larger than the intelligence package suggested. We're looking at a full Port Authority investigation, federal, multi-agency. And that means your cooperation isn't a one-time package. It means ongoing. Testimony, operational history, everything." Seok-won looked at Reyes being helped onto a stretcher, conscious now, talking to the agent beside him, his hand pressed against the cut above his eyebrow, with the automatic gesture of someone who wants to check whether something is still bleeding. "I know what it means," Seok-won said. He stood up from the concrete. His knees ached from the impact, and his hands still had the cold of the dock surface in them. He stood at full height in the middle of the warehouse lot, with the port noise around him and the federal activity moving past him in every direction, and looked out toward the fence line where the cargo cranes of Port Newark were visible above the perimeter, enormous and mechanical and indifferent, moving their containers in the precise arcs of a system that would continue operating regardless of what was happening to the people inside it. Then his phone buzzed. The number was the private medical facility in Weehawken. He picked up a nurse's voice, professional and calm. "Mr. Hahn, Ms. Whitfield regained consciousness about 20 minutes ago. She's stable and alert. She's been asking to make a phone call, and the contact she asked for was you." Seok-won turned away from the federal activity and the crane lines and the concrete expanse of the port lot and walked a few steps toward the perimeter fence and stood there with his phone pressed to his ear. "She's asking for me," he said. "Yes, sir." He closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. "Tell her I'll be there within the hour," he said. He ended the call. Walsh was behind him somewhere, still moving, still managing the expanding perimeter of what this morning had become. Min-soo was talking into his own phone near the car. The federal machinery was in full motion now, self-sustaining, no longer requiring him to push it. Seok-won put his phone in his pocket and stood at the perimeter fence of Port Newark and felt, for the first time in days, something that wasn't dread or calculation, or the cold focus of a man trying to stay ahead of a collapse. She was awake. She was asking for him. Whatever that meant, whether it was anger or information, or simply the disorientation of a person surfacing from days of unconsciousness, who reaches for the most proximate name he did not know yet. But she was awake, and she was asking. And he had an hour to close the distance between a port facility in Newark and a hospital room in Weehawken, and figure out what he was going to say when he walked through that door to the woman who had spent 7 years protecting him from dangers he'd never bothered to see, and who had finally paid the price for his comfortable blindness in a way that no amount of federal cooperation or organizational restructuring or carefully drafted statements to executive teams would ever fully settle. He turned back toward the car. His hands had stopped shaking. He hadn't noticed them shaking until they stopped, which was the kind of detail the body reveals only after the immediate danger has passed and the larger reckoning moves in to take its place. He walked toward the car. Min-soo fell into step beside him without a word. The drive back would take 40 minutes in midday traffic. It would not be enough time to prepare for whatever came next, but it was what he had. The drive from Port Newark to Weehawken took 43 minutes. Seok sat in the back of the car and did not look at his phone. Minsu had stopped talking, which was the most useful thing he could do. The city moved past the windows in its Tuesday afternoon indifference, the industrial corridor giving way to surface streets, the Hudson coming into view briefly between buildings, before disappearing again, and Seok-won sat with his hands loose in his lap and his eyes on the middle distance and thought about nothing in particular, which was something he had trained himself to do in the minutes before difficult conversations. Problem was that every difficult conversation he had ever trained for had been on his terms. He had chosen the room, the chair, the angle of approach. He had entered knowing what he wanted from the other person and what he was willing to give in exchange. He had moved through his professional life with the particular confidence of a man who understood leverage and rarely found himself without it. He did not know what Zuri wanted from him. He did not know what he had the right to offer. The facility was a 4-story building set back from the road behind a low hedge understated to the point of near invisibility, which was the point. The staff at the reception desk recognized him and didn't make him sign anything. The head nurse on the 4th floor, a compact Filipino woman named Soriano, who had worked with Seok-won's medical contacts for years, met him at the elevator and walked with him down the corridor. "She's been alert for about 90 minutes now," Soriano said. Cognitively, she's sharp, no indication of any neurological impact. She's in some pain from the rib injuries, which we're managing. Her blood pressure and hydration levels are improving. A brief pause. She's also quite angry. Seok-won looked at her. "Not at us," Soriano said. "Just in general. The way people are angry when they've been through something, and the shock has passed, and the anger has nowhere in particular to go yet." "That's understandable, yes." Soriano stopped outside a door. "She asked for you specifically. She also told me, and I'm relaying this directly, that if you came with lawyers, she would not speak to you." "I didn't bring lawyers." "Good." Soriano pushed the door open and held it. Seok-won stepped inside. The room was clean and quiet and had the specific calibrated neutrality of a private medical space. Nothing harsh, nothing warm, a temperature and a light level that were designed to be inoffensive to a wide range of human conditions. The window faced west and the afternoon light came through it at a low angle that crossed the foot of the bed and left the upper part of the room in comparative shadow. Zuri was sitting up. Not all the way the bed was angled to support her, and there was a pillow wedged behind her lower back that Seok-won suspected she had asked for rather than been offered. She had an IV line in her left arm. There was bruising along her jaw that had gone from dark purple to the greenish edges of something beginning to heal. Scene. Her hair was pulled back in the kind of rough, functional arrangement a person makes when they don't have their own materials and have done the best they can with what's available. She looked at him when he came through the door. He had been trying, in the car, not to prepare himself for any particular version of this. But even with that preparation, the thing that hit him when their eyes met was not what he expected. It wasn't fury, wasn't devastation, wasn't the specific quality of someone who has survived something terrible and is now ready to assign blame for it. What she looked like more than anything else was tired. Not the tiredness of sleep deprivation or physical recovery. Those were there too, visible in the set of her eyes and the careful way she held herself against the pain of the ribs, but a deeper tiredness. A sound like green wood splitting, the kind that comes from carrying something heavy for too long and suddenly putting it down and discovering that the muscles that held it don't know yet what to do with the absence of weight. He pulled the chair from near the window and set it beside the bed and sat down. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Outside, somewhere in the facility, a cart moved down a corridor, and someone spoke in a professional tone that was too far away to be distinct. "You found me," Zuri said. Her voice was rougher than normal. Dehydration and disuse had taken something from it, but the cadence was the same. That particular measured quality, each word given its exact proportion of weight. "Day 4, Seok-won said. "I know which day." She looked at him steadily. "I was counting." He absorbed that, "I know." "Do you? It wasn't quite a question." "I know you were counting because you knew someone would eventually look. You just didn't know how long it would take." He paused. "You thought it would be faster." Something moved in her face, not surprise, but the specific expression of someone who has had a thing articulated that they expected to have to explain, and the relief and anger of that collision. The first day, she said, I thought maybe by evening. I thought he'll notice, he'll call. Security will pull the cameras. She looked at her hands in her lap, the wrists still showing the raw marks. The zip ties had left. Faded now, but present. Second day, I told myself morning. By morning, he'll know. Zuri, I'm not saying this to hurt you, she said. Her voice was level, not cold, deliberate. I'm saying it because you should know what it was like in that room. Sitting in the dark and running the calculation and landing on the same answer every time. She looked at him. You didn't know I was gone because nothing that required you had disappeared. Your coffee wasn't made. Your calendar wasn't managed. But that was inconvenience. I wasn't inconvenience enough to be a missing person until day 2. The words sat in the room with the weight of something that had been held for a long time and was now simply set down on the nearest surface. You're right, Seok-won said. She watched him. You're right, he said again. I have no argument. I noticed the coffee. I noticed the calendar. I sent a text. He looked at her directly. I didn't notice you. A long beat. Tae-hyuk, she said, in federal custody. Since this morning. And Jin Tae. He was briefly surprised she had that name then wasn't, because Zuri had been paying attention to the interior of his organization for 7 years in ways he had never fully mapped. Also, federal custody. Her expression shifted something complicated, not satisfaction exactly, more like the particular feeling of a thing being confirmed that you had hoped was wrong and had known wasn't. Jin Tae knew, she said. Yes, for 2 years I thought so. She was quiet for a moment. There was a meeting about 2 years ago. I had flagged one of the vendor discrepancies for internal review, and Jin Tae personally pulled it back. Told me it had been resolved. I checked the resolution trail and it was clean. But the original discrepancy didn't match a resolution pattern I'd ever seen before. She paused. I put it in the file and kept watching. You documented it. I documented everything. A small pause. The files are in my office. The second drawer, under the HR compliance folders. There's a blue accordion binder that looks like regulatory archive material. She looked at him. Min-soo probably already has it. He does. She nodded. The encrypted drive, Seok-won said carefully. The one you copied Tae-hyuk's financial records onto. Her eyes found his with an attention that was, even now, even in a hospital bed with cracked ribs and a bruised jaw, completely precise. It's in my apartment, she said. Inside the cover of a legal textbook on the second shelf of the bookcase in my bedroom. Textbook is green. The drive is in an envelope taped to the inside back cover. I'll need to retrieve it. The passcode is my mother's birthday month, day, 4-digit year. She's the only person I've never used a generated password for. A brief pause. Don't write it down. I won't. She looked at him for a moment, then looked away toward the window and the low afternoon light, crossing the foot of her bed. The data on that drive, she said, is complete enough that you don't actually need Tae-hyuk's cooperation to make the financial case. He knows that, which is probably part of why he's talking. She was quiet for a second. I built it to be self-sufficient. You built it in case something happened to you. I built it in case something happened, and I wasn't available to explain it. She said it with the precise verbal distinction of someone who had been very careful in that room to maintain certain mental disciplines. I didn't let myself think in terms of something happening to me. Seok-won looked at his hands. Zuri, his voice had changed. Not the controlled professional register, not the flat, decisional tone he used in boardrooms and federal meetings. Something underneath that, older and less polished. I need to say something, and I need you to say it without interruption, because I don't know if I'll be able to get back to it once I stop. She looked at him. You spent 7 years doing things for me and for this organization that nobody asked you to do, and nobody acknowledged, and nobody I never saw. Not the vendor flags, not the federal contact, not the employee accommodations, not the protection. None of it. He stopped briefly. You were protecting people who had no idea they were being protected, including me, and you were doing it because it was the right thing to do and not for any other reason. And the one time, the one specific moment, when the situation required someone to protect you, I told you to leave it to security. He looked up at her. And security was Tae-hyuk's domain, which you may have already known. She held his gaze. I don't know how to give you back the 4 days, he said. I don't know how to give you back the moment you were sitting there in the dark, running the calculation and landing on the answer that I wasn't coming. I can't fix that. I can't buy my way out of it, or restructure my way out of it, or make a decision that retroactively undoes it. He paused. What I can tell you is that everything that can be done with the time I still have is being done. The organization is being opened for full federal review. The illegal infrastructure is being dismantled, and the people who put you in that room are in custody. He looked at her steadily. That's not an apology. I know it's not. I'm telling you because you earned the right to know exactly what happened after you disappeared, and you deserve to hear it from me while I'm sitting in the same room as you. Zuri was quiet for a long moment. Outside the window, the light shifted a cloud moving across the sun, the quality of the room changing by a fraction. I'm not going to come back as your secretary, she said. I know, I'm not going to come back at all, not to that role. I know, Zuri. She looked at him. Something in her expression moved, not softening exactly, but on some settling, the way water settles after you stop disturbing it. The employee welfare systems you're going to need to rebuild, she said. The whistleblower protections, the internal ethics function. She paused. Someone needs to design those from the ground up. Not retrofit them onto the existing structure. Build them independently, with authority that doesn't route through you or any other single executive. He looked at her. Someone who already knows where every gap is, she said, and why those gaps existed, and what kind of culture produces them. Are you telling me you want the job, he said. I'm telling you what the job needs to be, she said. And yes, the word landed quietly and completely. You'd report to the board, he said. Independent authority. Investigation rights across the entire organization. Including you. Including me. She studied him for a long moment, the careful, undeceived attention of a woman who had spent 7 years reading people in difficult situations and had learned to trust very little that wasn't demonstrated repeatedly over time. I'll need 3 months, she said finally, to recover. To think about it properly. To decide if what I see in 3 months is an organization that's actually changing, or one that's performing change while things settle back into the old shape. That's fair. I'm not asking if it's fair. I'm telling you the terms. I know, he said. Something shifted in her expression, then not warmth, not forgiveness, but a kind of recognition. The recognition of someone who has been talked past for a long time, hearing, for perhaps the first time, a response that doesn't redirect or qualify or absorb her words and return them altered. He had heard her. That was all, but it was the thing. She leaned her head back against the pillow and closed her eyes for a moment, the way a person does when they need to let the body remind itself that it's horizontal and supported and not required, right now, to hold anything up. You should go, she said, without opening her eyes. I need to sleep. I know. He stood from the chair. He moved it back to its original position near the window, which was unnecessary, but was the kind of thing you do when you need your hands to have something to do. He picked up his jacket from the back of it. Seok-won, Zuri said. He stopped. She opened her eyes and looked at him from the bed, the IV line, the bruised jaw, the raw wrist marks, the accordion of a person who has been through something real and is now in the process of building back toward vertical. The plant in my office, she said, the one on the windowsill. It needs water every 4 days. It's probably dead. He looked at her. It's probably dead, she said again, but water it anyway. He looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. I'll have someone water it, he said. Don't have someone water it. You water it. He thought about arguing. He didn't. All right, he said. He left. The weeks that followed were not clean. Nothing about the dismantling of a 15-year criminal infrastructure is clean. It is bureaucratic and repetitive, and requires the kind of sustained detail-level attention that is genuinely more exhausting than crisis. Because crisis at least has a pulse and a duration, whereas legal cooperation is a long gray corridor with no visible end. Seok-won spent most of November in meetings with federal attorneys, his own legal team, the board of Haneul Meridian, and at 2 points with federal prosecutors directly. The scope of what was being unwound was larger than even Min Su's thorough preliminary analysis had captured. There were offshore arrangements and port authority relationships and subcontracted routing agreements that had to be individually addressed, documented, and in most cases surrendered. The legal fees were considerable. The reputational cost was in some ways larger. Tae-hyuk's cooperation had been comprehensive. He had talked for 6 straight days in federal custody, producing a detailed account of the Dalsu network's East Coast operations that federal investigators later described. In documents, Seok-won was shown as part of the cooperation process, as the most complete operational map of that network they had ever obtained. Shin Dalsu was indicted in early December. The indictment was a 34-count document that took 2 hours to read into the record. Jin-tae's cooperation had been more complicated. He had talked, but the talking had required a kind of interior dismantling that was visible. Even in the transcripts, shown sentences that started and stopped. Long silences that the federal interviewer had learned not to fill. A man working through the process of describing a decision he had made 2 years ago that had seemed at the time like a manageable compromise and had turned out to be the first step of a long walk toward something unrecoverable. He received a reduced charge in exchange for his cooperation. He would serve time. Seok-won did not attend any of the proceedings, but Jae-won kept him informed in the minimal, factual way that legal reporting requires. In late November, Seok-won received a letter, physical mail, which nobody sent anymore. His name on the envelope in Jin-tae's handwriting, the same handwriting he had looked at on documents for 20 years. The same compressed, upright Korean script that appeared in the margins of meeting notes and on the backs of envelopes when Jin-tae needed to write down a number quickly. Inside was a single page. No salutation, I was not placed. I made a choice. The distinction matters to me, though I understand it changes nothing for you. 20 years of the first kind of thing don't cancel 2 years of the second. But I didn't want you to have to wonder if there was ever a version of the first 20 years that was real. There was, all of it. No signature. Seok-won read it twice and folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket and carried it there for the rest of the day, without knowing exactly why. He watered the plant in Zuri's office. He did it himself. As he'd said he would, once a week he went to her office, which had been left exactly as she'd kept it, and filled a small watering can at the bathroom, sink down the hall, and watered the plant on the windowsill. It was a pathos nearly impossible to kill, which explained why it had survived his inconsistent attention for 4 weeks. The leaves were slightly pale from the mist days while she was gone, but they had not dropped, and the stems were still firm. He did not tell anyone he was doing this. Min-soo knew, because Min-soo knew everything that happened on the executive floor, but he said nothing about it. The boardroom restructuring happened in stages, transparent reporting systems. An external audit committee that met quarterly with full access to vendor records and payment authorizations. A whistleblower channel managed by an independent law firm with a direct line to the board that bypassed the executive structure entirely. Security authorization split across 3 separate executives so that no single individual could access or modify the system comprehensively. Park Soo-yeon drove most of the HR rebuild. She turned out to have opinions about it that were considerably more specific than anyone had realized. And she expressed those opinions with a directness that Seok-won had apparently been suppressing by existing at the top of a hierarchy where people managed what they said around him. Without that filter, Park Soo-yeon was formidable and occasionally uncomfortable to be in a room with, which he now understood was a feature rather than a problem. He also understood that Zuri had probably always known this about her. December came. The legal proceedings moved at their own pace, which was slower than human patience, but faster than Seok-won had expected. The international shipping operations continued the legitimate operations, restructured and documented and monitored in ways they had never been before, runnings on slightly reduced margins because the arrangements that had inflated those margins were gone. The organization did not collapse. He had expected on some level that it would. A sound like green wood splitting, that the removal of the hidden infrastructure would destabilize the legitimate one, The way removing a wall that was never supposed to be load-bearing turns out to have become load-bearing through years of accumulated pressure. But Haneul Meridian's core business, the actual shipping and logistics work, the 400 employees, the international contracts, was genuinely viable on its own terms. It had always been. The criminal layer had been profitable, but it had also been a liability that the legitimate business had been carrying without realizing it. He thought about that sometimes. The things you carry that you think are supporting you. He called Zuri once in early December, not about anything specific. He said he was calling to check in, and she said she was fine, and they talked for 11 minutes about nothing in particular, about the legal proceedings, about a new logistics contract that had come through, a sound like green wood splitting, about whether the pothos on her windowsill was going to need repotting in the spring, and when they hung up, he sat in his office for a few minutes afterward and tried to identify what had just happened, which was harder than it should have been. She called him once in mid-December. It was 9:40 p.m. and he was still at his desk. "Are you at the office?" she said. "It's 9:40. I'm aware. A pause. I'm sending you something. A draft. Read it tonight and tell me what you think." She sent a 40-page document outlining the structure, authority, scope, and operational parameters of an independent employee advocacy and ethics function within Haneul Meridian. It was the most comprehensive internal policy document he had ever seen, not in length but in precision, each provision written to close a specific gap, each authority defined in terms that couldn't be compressed or rerouted by executive pressure. She had clearly been writing it for weeks, possibly since the day she'd told him she needed 3 months. At the bottom of the document, in a section titled Organizational Authority and Independence, she had written, "The Director of Employee Advocacy and Ethics shall report directly to the Board of Directors and shall possess the authority to investigate, document, and formally recommend action regarding any employee of Haneul Meridian Holdings, without exception and without the requirement of executive approval, including the Chief Executive Officer." He read that section twice. Then he sent her a text. "It's good. When do you want to discuss it?" She replied 4 minutes later after the new year. "I'm not done resting." He put his phone down and went back to work, and the particular quality of what he was feeling was something he did not try to name because he had learned, in the past several weeks, that some things functioned better when that some things to simply exist, rather than being classified and managed. New Year's came. The city was loud with it, and then quiet with it, and then the ordinary machinery of January started up, and the days resumed their normal texture of demands and decisions, and the particular forward pressure of running a large organization through a period of fundamental change. On the 3rd of January, Zuri Whitfield walked back into Haneul Meridian Holdings. She came through the main lobby entrance in an autumn coat, the color of cobalt, a color Seok-won associated. From this point forward, with the specific quality of a thing that has survived and is returning on its own terms. Her hair was out, natural curls framing her face, and she walked through the lobby with the particular ease of someone who has been somewhere difficult and come back knowing exactly what they left for. The security guard at the front desk, Rodriguez, the man whose overtime she had noted in her planner, whose wife had given birth in the fall, looked up when she came through the door, and his face did something immediate and unguarded. "Miss Whitfield," he said, and the relief in his voice was not professional. It was personal, the relief of someone who had been wondering for months, and was now looking at the answer. "Rodriguez." She stopped at his desk. "How's the baby?" 7 weeks old. She's great." He was smiling in the way people smile when they haven't done it unguardedly in a while, and the unfamiliarity makes it larger than they intended. "Her name is Clara." "Clara." Zuri said the name like she was testing its weight and finding it right. "Tell your wife congratulations. Properly. Not from the company, from me." "I will." He paused. "Welcome back." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was not quite a smile but was in the vicinity of one. "Thank you." She took the elevator to the executive floor. Seok-won was in the corridor when the doors opened, not waiting, or not intending to wait. He had been walking toward the accounting office for a meeting and had reached the elevator bank when the doors opened, and there she was. They looked at each other across the threshold of the elevator. She stepped out. The elevator doors closed behind her. January 3rd, he said. I said after the new year. I didn't say anything. She looked at him, the direct, calibrated attention she had always had, except that there was something else in it now, something that had come through the other side of a long and difficult experience and had not been distracted by it. A quality of clarity that was different from the professional composure he had always associated with her. The document, she said, the board reviewed it last week. They've approved the position written, including the authority provisions, including the one about the CEO, especially that one, he said. She studied him for a moment. I want my old office, she said. Same room, new title on the door. It's already yours. I didn't reassign it. I know you didn't. I checked. A brief pause. You also watered my plant. Someone had to. You did it yourself. She looked at him with the expression of someone who has received unexpected information and is deciding what to do with it. Soo-yin told me. He considered disputing this, decided against it. The pothos needed water, he said. She looked at him for a moment longer. Something in her face shifted, not softening. Still not that, but a kind of settling into something honest and undefended that she was choosing to allow rather than couldn't prevent. I read the Federal Cooperation Agreement, she said. The full version. Jae-won sent it to me. I know he did. I told him to. You're testifying in the Dal-Soo trial. Yes, that's going to be public. Your name, your history. The full scope of what Haneul Meridian was. Yes. She held his gaze steadily. That's going to be hard. I know what it's going to be. I'm not warning you, she said. I know you know. She stopped. Started again with the slight imprecision of someone choosing honest over polish. I wanted to say, I know it's not nothing. What you're doing. Testifying the cooperation, all of it. She paused. It matters. He looked at her. The corridor was quiet around them, the executive floor in the early morning, before most people had arrived, with the particular quality of a space that belongs to itself for a few hours before the day takes possession of it. Doesn't fix the 4 days, he said. No, she said. It doesn't, nothing does. No, she was quiet for a moment. But it's not nothing. That's all I said. Those are different statements. He looked at her for a long time. Come on, she said, and started walking toward her office at the end of the corridor. I have 40 pages of implementation, planning to go through with you before the board meeting Thursday. He fell into step beside her. They walked the length of the executive corridor together past the empty office, where Tae-yuk had spent 11 years building a patient betrayal, past the office where Jin-tae had sat behind a desk for 2 decades and made one wrong decision that hadn't canceled the previous 20 years, but had become inseparable from them. Past the section of corridor where the cameras had a known gap in coverage that Min-soo had already corrected, past all of it, toward the corner office at the end with its west-facing window and its single pothos on the sill with its slightly pale leaves and its firm stems. Zuri opened her office door. The room was exactly as she had left it. The desk, the files, surface of a workspace maintained by someone who understood that order is a form of respect for yourself, for the people who depend on your work, for the weight of what the work actually is. The second drawer, where the blue accordion binder sat under the HR compliance folders. She set her bag on the desk and took off her coat. The pothos on the windowsill caught the morning light coming through the glass, slightly pale, slightly stretched toward the source, but alive. You need a better watering schedule, she said, looking at it. I watered it every week. It needs it every 4 days. You told me every 4 days. I did every week. She looked at him over her shoulder. That's not what every 4 days means. I know what every 4 days means. Clearly you don't, because Zuri, he said her name with the particular quality of someone who is choosing deliberately to let a thing be what it is. I know what every 4 days means. I watered it once a week because I wasn't sure how long you were coming back, and I didn't want to overwater it. She looked at him. The morning light lay across the desk between them, and the pothos leaned slightly toward the window, and the city below was fully awake and moving with the particular energy of January, cold and forward and indifferent to whatever had happened in the previous 3 months, indifferent in the way that cities are, which is not cruelty, but simply the ongoing insistence of time. That Zuri started. Stopped. It's fine, he said. Survived. She looked at the plant. looked back at him. And for the first time since she had walked back through the lobby doors of Haneul Meridian Holdings, something in her face that had been carefully held, released not completely, not in the way of a person who has resolved something, but in the way of a person who has decided, for right now, to put one thing down. "Sit down," she said. "I have 40 pages and you have a Thursday deadline." He pulled the chair from the corner of her office. Not the one across the desk, the secondary chair she kept for longer working conversations, and sat in it. Zuri opened her bag and took out the document and set it on the desk between them and reached for a pen. The document was 40 pages. They had 2.5 hours before the building would fill, and the day would make its own demands. They started on page 1. 6 months later, Haneul Meridian Holdings looked different from the inside in ways that were not easily visible from the outside. The lobby was the same. The logo above the reception desk was the same. The building itself had not moved, but the executive floor operated on different principles. Doors that had been closed were open. Conversations that had been routed upward through layers of management were happening directly. The whistleblower system that the independent law firm managed had received 14 reports in its first 4 months of operation, none of them dramatic, all of them the ordinary texture of a large organization in which people had finally been given a mechanism for saying when something felt wrong and were using it. Seok-won had testified in the Dalsu preliminary proceedings in March. He had sat in a federal courtroom in Lower Manhattan and answered questions for 4 hours about the operational history of Haneul Meridian's non-declared cargo arrangements, the port authority relationships, the structure of the network he had spent 15 years building. His name had been in the papers the following morning. His photograph had appeared in 3 news outlets. He had read the coverage and then set it aside and gone to work. The Dalsu trial itself was scheduled for the fall. Tae-hyuk would testify as a cooperating witness. The federal case was, by all legal accounts Jae-won relayed to him, solid. Reyes had recovered fully from the injuries he'd sustained at the Port Newark warehouse. He had left the Port Authority employment in February and was working in a different logistics capacity in a different state. Seok-won had not contacted him. Walsh had told him, in one of their last debriefing sessions, that Reyes had said when asked if he had anything to say about Han Seok-won that he had been in that warehouse for 6 hours and had believed, at several points, that he was not going to leave it, and that the man who had shown up in the lot and told the 2 men to let him go had not hesitated. That was the word Reyes had used, had not hesitated. Seok-won, when Walsh told him this, had said nothing. There was nothing particularly useful to say about it. On a Tuesday in late June, Seok-won arrived at the office at 7:45 and found a note on his desk in Zuri's handwriting. Not a message from her assistant, she didn't have an assistant, had refused one. A decision Seok-won had questioned, and she had not debated, but a handwritten note on a piece of her personal notepad left on his desk before he arrived. Board meeting Thursday at 3. I'm presenting the Q2 ethics report. You should read the section on page 7 before you walk in. He read page 7. The section was titled Patterns of Cultural Obstruction, Historical Analysis and Forward Recommendation. It documented, with the specific detail that characterized everything Zuri produced, the mechanisms by which Haneul Meridian's previous organizational culture had enabled the conditions that Tae-hyuk had exploited, not by blaming any single actor, but by mapping the structural patterns that had made the exploitation possible and had prevented its earlier detection. It named the culture rather than the individuals. It recommended specific changes to promotion criteria, to meeting protocols, to how dissent was formally registered and responded to. At the bottom of page 7, in the last paragraph of the section, she had written, the most significant enabler of the documented failures was not the presence of bad actors within the organization. Bad actors exist in all large organizations. The most significant enabler was the absence of a culture in which the quietest person in the room was understood to possess information that the loudest person needed. Building that culture is not a structural project. It is a daily practice, and it begins with whoever holds the most authority in any given room choosing, repeatedly and without fanfare, to stop talking first. He read that paragraph twice. Then he put the report in his bag to take home and finish that evening. At 9:15, his phone buzzed with a text from Zuri. "Did you have breakfast?" He looked at it. "No," he typed. "There's food in the fourth-floor kitchen. Someone brought it for the team. Eat something." He set the phone down. He picked it up again. "Is this within your authority as Director of Ethics?" he typed. Her reply came back in 40 seconds. "Employee well-being falls under my purview." "Yes." He looked at his phone for a moment. Then he stood up from his desk and walked to the fourth-floor kitchen and ate breakfast, standing at the counter, looking out the window at the city below in the particular quality of a Tuesday morning in late June, warm, ordinary, continuous. The pothos in Zuri's office had been repotted in April. It was noticeably larger now, the stems trailing over the edge of the new container, the leaves a darker and more saturated green than they'd been in the pale winter months. He had not repotted it. He didn't know who had. He thought about asking. He decided it didn't matter. Some things grew back without an explanation for how, and the appropriate response to that was not to analyze it, but to make sure you were watering it on the correct schedule. He finished his breakfast, rinsed the plate, and went back to work.